Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. The old amusement park had been closed for years, a skeletal reminder of better times. I never thought I'd visit it, but when my friend suggested sneaking in for a midnight adventure, I couldn't say no. We slipped through a hole in the rusted chain-link fence, the moon casting eerie shadows over the empty rides. The air smelled of damp earth and metal, like a place that had been forgotten by time. The Ferris wheel loomed overhead, its seats swaying slightly in the breeze. I could almost hear children's laughter carried away on the wind. My friend Jesse, ever the brave one, dared me to climb into one of the seats. I laughed, but I did it. The iron was cold under my fingertips, the paint flicking away as I climbed. As I settled into the seat, I noticed the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in a forest or an abandoned house. This was heavier, like the park itself was holding its breath. Then I heard a faint, mechanical whirring. The Ferris wheel shuddered as if an unseen force was trying to turn it. I looked around. Everyone was still on the ground, staring up at me. "Hey, stop messing around," Jesse shouted, his voice echoing. I raised my hand, a grin playing at the edges of my lips. But before I could answer, the seat jerked forward. My heart stopped as the wheel began moving, creaking and groaning. I reached for the safety bar, but it snapped shut on its own, trapping me in place. Panic clawed at me. The night seemed darker as I was lifted higher and higher. Below, my friends screamed, but their voices grew distant, swallowed by the relentless noise of the wheel turning. My pulse pounded as the wind picked up, ruffling my hair and tugging at my jacket. I could see the top of the roller coaster track, its rusted loops like skeletons frozen in time. And then I saw a shadow darting between the rides, moving too fast for the eye to follow. It was human in shape, but stretched and warped, limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Help?" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the wind. The Ferris wheel reached the peak, and I realized it had stopped moving. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as I stared out at the park below me. The shadow paused, just under the carousel, its head tilted, eyes black and hollow, as if looking directly at me. The air crackled, sharp with electric tension. Suddenly, the carousel sprang to life. The horses spun wildly, their painted eyes glinting in the moonlight, and a low, grinding music began to play. The shadow moved again, closer this time, the edges of its form blurring as it approached the wheel. I was trapped, helpless, as the wind surged and the ride started moving faster. I clung to the seat, eyes wide with terror as the shadow reached the base of the Ferris wheel, feet skimming the ground. Then it jumped. Time slowed as it soared up, arms outstretched, its form twisting midair. I saw its face, a face like a broken mask with an impossible grin, eyes wide and gleaming with malice. The wheel snapped to a halt, throwing me forward. Everything blurred as I fell, and then there was only darkness. When I woke up, I was on the ground. The park was silent again, too silent. My friends were staring at me, their eyes wide and afraid. "Are you okay?" Jesse whispered. He helped me up, but something was wrong. My chest felt cold, hollow, like the air inside was slipping through me. "I think so," I said, but I couldn't stop shivering. And then I looked down. My shadow wasn't mine. It stood behind me, twisted and smiling, and I knew the amusement park wasn't empty. It started as an innocent idea. My friends and I were looking for something to do one evening, and when Mark suggested we explore the abandoned amusement park just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. We were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill, unaware that the park had a reputation. The sun was just beginning to set as we approached the rusted gates, which hung crooked and creaked in the wind. The faded, peeling sign read "Wonderland of Wonders" in letters that had almost been swallowed by time. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and the faint, sharp tang of rust. The place was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant screech of a crow. We walked past the ticket booth, its glass pane shattered and dark, and made our way to the old Ferris wheel. It loomed above us, a skeletal giant. The paint was chipped and flaking, and the seats were bent and warped. some hanging at odd angles. We dared each other to climb up into the rusted cars and take photos. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture as Sam posed dramatically, making a face. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a stick tapping on metal. At first, I thought it was just a rodent, but then it came again, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was staring at the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow, as if they had seen something that terrified them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a breath. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial air now replaced with tension. We started walking toward the carousel when the tapping sound came again, this time from behind us. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the place was empty. Just the broken down rides, the scattered debris, and the wind that seemed to have picked up speed. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, glancing nervously at the way we had come. "No, let's check out the fun house," Sam said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but it came out hollow. We hesitated, but curiosity won out, and we made our way toward the warped fun house at the center of the park. The entrance was a gaping mouth, the teeth jagged and chipped. The darkness inside seemed to beckon us. We stepped inside, and the air grew colder, the smell of damp and decay stronger. The floor creaked as we moved through, and suddenly the sound started up again, tapping, like fingernails on glass. I shivered, but before I could say anything, Sam screamed. We rushed to him, finding him backed up against a mirror, staring at his reflection. But it wasn't just his reflection, it was a face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It moved, just slightly, tilting its head like it was studying him. He stumbled away, pushing past us, and we bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for breath. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the silence was deafening. We didn't speak, just ran back to the entrance, but as I glanced behind me, I saw hundreds of reflections in the shattered mirrors of the funhouse, all faces that were watching us, grinning, unmoving. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping and shaking, looking back to see the amusement park shrouded in darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the broken rides. To this day, we never speak of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping sound, like nails on glass, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, a reflection is waiting for me to look. The summer I spent helping my uncle on his farm is one I'll never forget. He ran the place solo, the land stretching for miles under an ever-cloudy sky. I loved the open fields and the cool breeze that seemed to carry whispers through the tall corn. The farm was remote, with no neighbors for miles. I thought I knew every sound and shadow that came with it, but I was wrong. It started as a normal evening. The golden light dipped behind the hills as I finished up the chores, sweeping hay and feeding the goats. My uncle was already in the house, his shadow long across the barn floor as he called out for dinner. I turned to lock up the barn, the rusted hinges creaking like an old man's bones. That's when I heard a deep, guttural noise coming from the woods beyond the edge of the farm. I squinted through the twilight, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the coyotes. Their howls were sharper, more playful. This was low, slow, like the rumble of a distant, dying engine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind in the trees. The next evening, I heard it again. This time, the noise was closer, resonating in my bones like a warning. I had just finished milking the cows when the rumble came, followed by a faint dragging sound. It was as if something heavy was being dragged through the underbrush. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just some stray animal. My uncle, old and unyielding, noticed my hesitation when I came inside. "You hear that, boy?" he asked, eyes sharp under the dim lamplight. He didn't wait for me to respond. "Stay inside after dark. You don't know what's out there." That night, sleep came hard. Every time I dozed off, the dragging noise jolted me awake. The sounds of footsteps, rough and uneven, scraping along the wooden floor outside the bedroom window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I dared not move. I could almost hear it breathing, something wet and rasping, like the air after a storm. The next day, I asked my uncle if he'd heard the sounds, but he just gave me a hard look. "I've lived here my whole life," he said, leaning over the kitchen table. "I've never heard anything like that before." That evening, the noise was louder than ever. It was as if something had been waiting for me to notice it, biding its time. I crept outside, armed with only a lantern and a rusty pitchfork. The air was thick and still, too quiet for comfort. I shivered, the skin on my arms crawling as I moved toward the trees. I saw then a figure that didn't belong. A man, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs bent like branches, his face hidden in shadow. He stood motionless, just beyond the line of trees, staring at me with eyes that reflected the lantern's light like twin, bottomless pools. The ground shifted, and I realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, the earth moved as if breathing, the grass parting to reveal shapes that writhed in the dark. My legs froze in place, and I could only watch as the figures emerged, eyes wide, mouths agape, hands reaching out like they wanted to pull me in. The dragging noise roared louder, almost deafening, as one of the figures lunged toward me, its face illuminated just enough to see that it had none. A yawning hollow, the size of a fist, where its features should have been. I screamed and ran back to the house, stumbling and nearly tripping over the roots of an ancient oak. I didn't stop until I slammed the front door shut, the lock clicking into place behind me. My uncle came running, but the sounds had faded. He looked at me, concern in his eyes, but he said nothing. We sat in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling it press down on us. That night, as dawn approached, the noise came back, a low thrum like the heartbeat of the earth. But it was different this time, quieter, almost like it was satisfied. I never saw them again, but I heard them whenever I went out to the barn, a low drag and an echo that whispered, "We're waiting." And now, I know what my uncle meant when he said, "You don't know what's out there." Because whatever it was, it knew me, and it wasn't done yet. I had never planned to go to the carnival that night. It was late, the air crisp and stinging as I stepped off the bus, but something about the distant lights and the sound of carnival music drew me in. The streets were almost empty. The only signs of life were the neon lights, casting multicolored reflections in the puddles at my feet. I could hear the faint, cheerful laughter from the fairgrounds, the clatter of the Ferris wheel, and the excited shouts of kids. The carnival was smaller than I'd imagined, nothing more than a cluster of rickety rides and booths run by tired-looking operators. I wandered through, tempted by the smell of fried dough and popcorn, the squeals of kids whirling through the air, their faces frozen in joy. I spent a while watching a clown juggle flaming torches, unable to stop myself from smiling at the effortless act. It was nearing midnight when I found myself by the haunted house. A faded, battered sign read, "Dare to enter only the brave." I laughed at the exaggeration, feeling a sudden thrill at the thought of a little scare. I paid my ticket to the operator, a wiry man whose eyes seemed sharp to knowing. He grinned, a gap-toothed, unsettling smile. "Have fun," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the carnival music. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The air was damp, with the musty scent of old wood and mildew. A low, grinding sound echoed behind me as the door creaked shut, and a surge of nervous excitement washed over me. The hallway was narrow, lined with torn velvet curtains and old paintings that seemed to watch me as I walked past. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. A dissonant chime sounded, and suddenly, a voice whispered from the darkness, "Don't look back." I whipped around, my pulse quickening. Empty. I pushed forward, more out of instinct than reason. The path twisted and turned, each section darker and more sinister than the last. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with the sound of footsteps behind me. I tried to tell myself it was part of the act, but there was something about the way the footsteps echoed, almost as if there were more than one pair. I reached the final room, a small space with a cracked mirror on one wall and an old rocking chair in the middle. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. The rocking chair creaked back and forth, moving with no one sitting in it. Then the voice came again, closer this time, coming from the darkness behind me. "You should never have come here." I spun around and gasped. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its shape shrouded in the dark. I could just make out the outline of its twisted limbs and a face that was impossibly, grotesquely contorted. It stepped forward, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. "It's not real," I whispered, the sound cracking in the silence. But the figure kept coming, inch by inch, dragging its feet as it advanced. The mirror shattered, a sharp, piercing sound that made me jump. The operator's voice, now louder and clearer, resonated through the room. "I warned you." I made a run for it, throwing myself at the door. It opened, and I stumbled out into the night, panting and shaking. The carnival music was still playing, but now it sounded distorted, warped, as if it were coming from far, far away. I glanced back, and for a split second, I saw it standing in the doorway of the haunted house, watching, waiting. Its face, a mirror of mine, but cracked and twisted, grinned at me before vanishing into the dark. I didn't look back as I ran to the bus stop. But when I finally sat down, trying to catch my breath, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes were wide, and a thin, red line was traced down my cheek, as if someone had drawn it with a blade. And then I realized I wasn't alone. There was a shadow in the seat behind me, perfectly still, waiting. The old library was as quiet as a tomb, but that was part of its charm. It was an ancient building with towering shelves that groaned under the weight of hundreds of thousands of books. I loved it, despite its creaking floors and dim, flickering lights. It was the one place I felt truly at peace, away from the noise and chaos of the world. I'd been working there as a night custodian for months, a job that suited me perfectly. On this particular night, I was finishing my last sweep of the upper floor, the one with the old, leather-bound volumes. The air was heavy with the scent of paper and dust, and the silence seemed almost to press against my eardrums. I just rounded a corner when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone's nails drumming against a desk. I paused, peering into the shadows. The sound had come from the far end of the room, where the dim light barely reached. I should have told myself it was just my imagination, but the chill creeping up my spine told me otherwise. My heart pounded as I moved toward the noise, each step louder than the last in the oppressive silence. As I neared the sound, the tapping stopped abruptly. I stopped too, breath caught in my throat. The library was as still as before, except now I could hear my own heartbeat, echoing in the empty room. I glanced around nervously, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back. That's when I saw it. A book, on a pedestal near the window, was open, its pages fluttering as though someone had just turned them. But there was no breeze. I took a cautious step forward, eyes fixed on the book. The words written in old, spidery script seemed to twist and rearrange before my eyes, forming a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned to run, but a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. The growl came from the direction of the rows of bookshelves, the sound of something heavy moving through the dark. My mind raced as I strained to see what was there. I caught a glimpse of something dark, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It was as if the creature was made from the pages of the books themselves, its form shifting and warping in a grotesque dance. I sprinted toward the stairs, my fingers fumbling for the keys on my belt. My heart was in my throat as I threw open the exit door, slamming it behind me and locking it as fast as I could. The growl continued, but now it was muffled, fading behind the thick, old wood. I stood there in the dark hallway, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. The echo of the creature's movements seemed to reverberate in my bones, even through the closed door. I stumbled back, barely keeping my balance, and caught my reflection in a window. My eyes were wide, my pupils dilated, but then I saw it, a shadow, dark and thin, creeping across the glass from the inside. My pulse skyrocketed as I felt an icy, bony hand rest on my shoulder. I whipped around to find no one there. The library was silent again, but I knew better now. It was waiting, watching, and it knew my fear. I stumbled toward the exit, never taking my eyes off the dark windows. That night, I learned the hard way that some places keep their secrets locked between their pages, waiting for a visitor foolish enough to read them, and I was never going back. It was supposed to be an easy night out, a few friends, and I had decided to go stargazing. We found a quiet, isolated hilltop that overlooked the city, far away from the bright lights and noise. The evening had been perfect at first, with the sky an endless sea of stars, a cool breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers, and laughter as we set up our blankets and telescoped out. As the night deepened, the air became colder, more oppressive. We didn't mind at first. We were too busy taking turns peering through the telescope and making silly jokes. But the deeper we went into the night, the more the landscape around us seemed to change. The trees, which had been a comforting ring of shadows, now felt like they were watching us, their branches moving in strange, unnatural ways. The rustling wasn't the wind, it was as if the forest had a life of its own. I shifted on my blanket and glanced at my phone. It was nearly midnight, and I was starting to feel an inexplicable sense of dread. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, one of my friends, Jenna, screamed. We all turned to see her standing by the edge of the hill, her face pale, eyes wide. "What is it?" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "There's someone down there," she gasped, pointing into the dark. We all stared in the direction she indicated, but I couldn't see anything, just the inky blackness of the forest below. "Jenna, there's no one there," Matt said, trying to sound reassuring. But there was a tremble in his voice that made my skin crawl. "No, look," she insisted, eyes locked on something in the trees. I squinted, heart thudding in my chest as I tried to see what she saw. It wasn't a person. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long and bendy, like a scarecrow brought to life. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and even from a distance, I could tell it was staring right at us. "Guys, we need to go. Now," I said, my voice cracking. We gathered our things, but as we started back toward the car, the sound of footsteps came from behind us, uneven and dragging. It felt as though the woods were closing in, surrounding us with the faint, dry rustling of leaves and the thud of heavy feet. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a second figure, this one closer, emerging from the dark. Its eyes were hollow and glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly yellow. My breath caught in my throat as we broke into a run, the air sharp with panic and the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. "Go, go, go," Matt shouted, pushing past me. We all sprinted for the car, the night echoing with the crunch of footsteps behind us. When we finally reached the vehicle, I fumbled to unlock it. Heart racing as the shadows stretched and shifted around us, we piled into the car, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as a figure emerged at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with those hollow eyes. It tilted its head slowly, a broken, jerky motion that made my blood run cold. "Drive, drive," Jenna shouted, and Matt didn't hesitate. The tires screeched against the gravel as we peeled away, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures, their twisted bodies still watching us, still following, until they vanished back into the woods. We didn't stop until we were safely back in town. Every one of us is shaken to speak, but as I lay in bed that night, trying to find sleep, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing, hollow eyes watching us from the dark. The next day, I went back to the hilltop with a friend, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But when we arrived, I found something that made my stomach twist. At the base of the trees were deep, wide tracks, footprints with long, claw-like toes that seemed to stretch into the woods, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the distance, I swore I heard a voice, ragged and whispering, coming from the dark, saying, "You are not supposed to leave." It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. I was at the local fair, surrounded by the chatter of families and the blare of carnival games. Bright lights and the smell of fried dough filled the air, and for a moment, I felt like a kid again. My friend Sam and I decided to try the haunted house, a flimsy wooden structure with peeling paint and an overworked fog machine. The line was long, but we were excited until we stepped inside. The first room was dark, almost too dark. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, I found myself staring at a series of cracked mannequins dressed like characters from a 1950s horror movie. The stench of musty cloth and old plastic burned my nostrils. I laughed, nudging Sam as we walked past. The place felt cheap, like someone's homemade nightmare, but that was half the fun. We moved through a maze of rooms, each more ridiculous than the last. A room with flickering lights and creepy music, another filled with fake cobwebs and latex spiders. But then, we entered a hallway that felt different. The air changed, grew colder. I felt an inexplicable shiver, a wave of dread washing over me as I took a step forward. It was then that I noticed the sound. The soft, rhythmic tapping behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I felt Sam's hand on my arm, urging me to keep moving. I took a deep breath and followed him into the next room. The dim lights illuminated a display of shattered mirrors, each shard reflecting our faces in 1,000 jagged pieces. But as I moved forward, I noticed something strange. One of the mirrors didn't reflect us. It showed a dark, twisted figure standing at the far end of the room. It was hunched, with limbs too long and thin, and its face was obscured by a veil that shifted as though alive. "Sam, look," I whispered, pointing. He followed my gaze, and his eyes widened. "What is that?" The figure in the mirror moved. I blinked, and for a split second, I thought I saw it step forward into the room. I screamed, grabbing Sam's arm as I pulled him back toward the entrance. The mannequin's eyes seemed to follow us, and the tapping behind us grew louder. Like a parade of tiny feet against the wooden floor, we burst out into the main part of the fair, gasping for air as the night seemed to rush back to life. The laughter of children, the barkers calling people to their booths, it all felt too loud, too bright. We stopped at the edge of the fairgrounds, trying to process what we'd seen. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I turned to Sam, ready to tell him that we should leave, but my breath caught in my throat. A small figure stood just beyond the lights, barely visible in the shadows. It looked like a child, but something was off. Its eyes were too big, too wide, and it tilted its head in a way that no child ever could. Before I could move, it let out a high-pitched giggle that made my blood freeze. It raised a small hand, and in its palm was a shard of broken mirror, jagged and glinting in the light. The air turned cold again, and that same rhythmic tapping from before came from all directions. I grabbed Sam's wrist, pulling him as we sprinted toward the exit. We passed the ticket booth and the line of people waiting to get in, but they didn't see us. Their eyes were vacant, fixed on nothing, and their mouths moved in silent, unending chants. We made it out into the parking lot, the muffled sounds of the fair fading behind us. I dared one last look back and saw the small figure at the edge of the fair, standing in the spot where the haunted house once was. The mirrors on its face shattered like glass, falling away to reveal what was underneath, a mouth full of sharp, glistening teeth. It was still watching as we drove away, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw it smiling, its eyes catching the light, reflecting thousands of pieces of itself. It was supposed to be a peaceful day at the beach. I had planned to spend the day with my younger brother, Liam, just the two of us. Our parents had taken off for the weekend, and with school out for the summer, it felt like the perfect time to enjoy some sun and salt water. We loaded up the old beach wagon with towels, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks and headed to the secluded cove that I discovered years ago, a place far from the crowded main beach. The sun was high in the sky, casting everything in brilliant gold. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks was soothing, and the distant cries of seagulls were a familiar soundtrack. We set up our spot close to the water, building a small fort of beach towels and umbrellas. I splashed around in the surf while Liam played in the sand, building his usual sand castles that were more fortresses than anything else. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a shift in the air. The breeze had picked up, and the temperature dropped slightly. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause. I glanced at Liam, who was now sitting on a pile of seashells, staring out at the horizon with an odd expression on his face. "Hey, you okay?" I called, waving to get his attention. He didn't respond immediately. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were wide and unfocused, like he was seeing something far away. "Liam," I said again, walking up to him. He stood up, his face pale. "There's someone out there," he whispered, pointing out to the water. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing unusual, just the endless stretch of sea and sky. "Liam, there's no one there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was a tremble in it. He shook his head, refusing to look away. The wind picked up, the waves slapping against the shore more urgently now, as if the ocean itself was trying to warn us. Just then, I heard a low, guttural groan that came from the direction of the cove's rocky outcrop. I glanced toward it, but the rocks were empty. The sound grew louder, closer, like something was coming up from the depths. I grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him away from the water as a sudden wave crashed onto the shore, spraying us with cold salt water. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight with fear. As we gathered our things, I caught sight of something moving out of the corner of my eye, dark figures, shapes in the water that seemed to shift and flow like ink. They were watching us, and then they were moving toward us, gliding through the water without making a sound. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pulled Liam up the beach, our feet sinking into the warm sand as we ran. But when I looked back, I saw them more clearly now, figures, pale and ragged, with limbs that twisted at impossible angles. Their eyes, dark and hollow, followed us as we fled. We stumbled up the path that led to the main road, the sand scraping at our bare feet. The distant roar of the waves and the groaning from the cove behind us faded, replaced by the heavy thumping of our breaths. Once we reached the car, I fumbled for the keys, almost dropping them as my hands shook. "Are they following us?" Liam gasped, looking back down the dirt road. But there was nothing, just the empty path leading back to the cove. I turned the car on and sped away, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What were those things? Why did they come to the shore, to the place where we were? And why did Liam see them before I did? The rest of the day passed in a blur, and I never told anyone what had happened. But every now and then, when I close my eyes at night, I hear that low groan coming from the direction of the ocean, and I remember the eyes in the water, waiting. I'll never forget the day I decided to take a solo hike up the mountain. It had been a stressful few weeks, and I needed some time away from the noise, from people. The trail I chose was one I'd been on before, years ago. But today it felt different, almost as if the mountain was watching me. The first few miles were easy, just a steady climb with the scent of pine filling the air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. I was lost in my thoughts when I noticed the silence. It wasn't natural, not the kind of silence you get when you're deep in the woods. This was complete, heavy, as if someone had hit the mute button on the world. I stopped, peering around. The breeze had vanished, and the birds had stopped singing. My skin prickled, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I kept going, determined not to let the unease get to me. The trail wound higher, the trees growing thicker, their trunks gnarled and blackened as if they had been scorched long ago. The deeper I went, the darker it became, even though it was still afternoon. The light seemed to be swallowed by the woods. Then, I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping. I paused, my heart jumping into my throat. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone tapping on wood, over and over. I listened, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move, following me as I hesitated on the path. The thumping grew louder, echoing in the silence. Panic clawed at my chest, and I turned, my eyes darting between the twisted trees. That's when I saw a pale hand, its fingers long and bony, reaching out from behind a tree, just barely visible in the shadow. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward. "Hey," I shouted, my voice cracking. The hand retracted, disappearing behind the tree with a sudden jerk. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed, my heart thundering in my chest. I had to get out of there. I spun around and bolted down the trail, branches whipping at my face, the thumping still echoing behind me. My legs burned, and I could barely see through the thick underbrush. I was running blindly now, hoping to get to a clearing, a place where I could see. The trail seemed to stretch forever, but then, just as I thought I was about to collapse, I emerged from the woods into a small, sunlit clearing. The air was different here, fresher, warmer. My breathing slowed as I looked around, searching for any sign of the presence that had been following me. And then I saw it. At the far end of the clearing, leaning against a dead tree, was a figure. It was tall, with an unnatural, gangly posture. Its face was obscured by the hood of its tattered cloak, but I could see the faint glow of eyes beneath. They were wide and dark, like wells of black ink, and they stared directly at me. The thumping had stopped, but now there was only the sound of my heartbeat, echoing in my ears. The figure lifted its head, and with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, It whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to the ground, eyes locked on the figure as it took a step forward, the cloak flowing around it like smoke. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before I blacked out was that pale hand reaching out, fingers long and skeletal. When I woke up, the sun was setting, casting the clearing in an orange glow. The figure was gone. My head pounded as I stood, glancing around the clearing. There was no sign of the trail back down, no sign of the mountain path I had taken. Just the woods, dense and still, like I was trapped in a different world. I heard it again, the thumping, coming from deep within the trees. But this time, it was joined by a second sound: footsteps, rapid and uneven. I turned, my blood turning cold as I realized I wasn't alone, and whatever had followed me was waiting. It started as a day trip. My friends and I decided to head to the old amusement park on the edge of town. It had been shut down for years, ever since a series of accidents forced the city to close it down. I don't know why we chose that place. Maybe we were curious. Maybe we just wanted to prove we were brave. But from the moment we stepped through the rusted gate, something felt wrong. The park was overrun with weeds and vines that clawed their way up the rusted skeletons of roller coasters and Ferris wheels. The painted signs were faded, peeling, their once cheerful colors muted by time and decay. It felt as if the place had been waiting for us, the silence broken only by the distant sound of crows cawing. We laughed it off, taking pictures and making jokes, but the laughter didn't reach my chest. I felt a chill every time I passed the cracked bumper cars, their paint chipped and dull, the seats torn. Something about them seemed familiar, like they were expecting me to get in. Then we made our way to the funhouse, its funhouse mirrors warped and dark. The entrance creaked as we pushed it open, and a draft of cold air washed over me. The inside was a maze of mirrors that seemed to stretch and bend, showing reflections that weren't quite right. I noticed my friends laughing as they walked ahead, their reflections bending in impossible ways, their eyes distorted and wide-eyed as I walked through. I stopped in front of a mirror that showed me with a twisted smile and eyes far too big. My own face, staring back, seemed like it wasn't mine. I backed away, tripping over my own feet, and spun around to call out to my friends. But they were already gone, their voices echoing faintly from somewhere deeper inside. I ran after them, my footsteps swallowed by the hollow hallways. The sounds of their laughter had stopped. I reached an area where the mirrors were shattered, jagged shards protruding from the floor like teeth. I stepped carefully, heart racing, and then I heard a slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking with heavy boots behind me. I spun around, my chest heaving, but there was no one there. A sudden crash reverberated through the funhouse, and I jolted. The sound came from the direction I had been heading. I pushed through the torn curtains and stepped out into the open air, gasping for breath. The sky had darkened, and the crows had grown louder, their caws echoing like screams. I scanned the park, looking for my friends. They were nowhere in sight, but then a shadow caught my eye, a figure, cloaked in something that looked like tattered fabric, standing under the Ferris wheel. It was too still, too quiet, and then I realized it wasn't just standing. It was facing me. The figure stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace, its arms swinging too far as if disjointed. I stumbled back, tripping over an abandoned ride. I reached out, my hands scraping against the cold metal. I tried to push myself up. "Hey," a voice called out, sharp and familiar. It was my friend Jody. I turned, relief flooding through me as I saw her and the others running toward me. But when I looked past them, the figure was still there, unmoving, watching. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could see a pale hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. The others reached me, breathless, eyes wide. Jody glanced over her shoulder, and her face drained of color. "Did you see that thing?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the sound of the old roller coaster creaking filled the air, and the figure turned, slowly, as if pulled by some invisible force. We didn't stick around to see what happened next. We ran, the wind tearing at our clothes, the distant laughter of the funhouse echoing like a cruel joke. When we made it back to the car, we looked at each other, gasping, trying to process what we'd seen. The park loomed behind us, silent again, as if it had never been disturbed, But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the park, watching, with a small, twisted smile that I could never unsee. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of life. My friends and I rented an old cabin in the woods. Remote, quiet, peaceful, or so we thought. We arrived just before sunset, the air thick with the smell of pine. The cabin was small but charming, nestled between towering trees, the kind of place you see in postcards. The first night, we gathered around the fireplace, chatting about everything and nothing, enjoying the crackling of the fire. The wind outside was gentle, almost soothing, and we settled in for a comfortable night. But as the evening wore on, something strange started happening. It was subtle at first, just a chill in the air that crept in even though the fire was blazing. Then there was the sound of soft, scraping noise from somewhere deep in the house. It was faint at first, like nails on wood. I ignored it, attributing it to the old house settling. Then, the knock came. It was a soft tap on the door, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone stopped talking. We all glanced at the door, confused. The knocking continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. We were miles away from any neighbors. There was no way anyone could have wandered up here without us hearing them. We all got up and checked the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing, no one. Just the dark, empty woods. We laughed it off, assuming it was some odd sound from the house itself. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, but it wasn't the usual gusts of wind. It was unnaturally consistent, like something was pushing against the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang. It echoed through the cabin like someone had slammed a door somewhere. I immediately sat up, heart racing, and listened. The wind had stopped. Everything was eerily silent. Then, the same scraping sound started again, this time from just outside my room. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the floorboards, trying not to make a sound. I peeked out through the small crack in my door. Nothing, just the dark hallway stretching out in front of me. But then, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing still at the far end of the hall, half hidden in shadow. It was tall. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back into my room, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut out the fear. The next morning, the others didn't seem as rattled. We all pretended like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been watching us. Later, that afternoon, we decided to take a hike to clear our heads. We walked through the woods, the trees whispering above us in the wind. As we returned to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was ajar, wide open. We had locked it before we left. We rushed inside, but everything seemed normal. No sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. Just the same unsettling quiet that had followed us since the first night. But when I passed the hallway mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was something behind me, a shadow standing just out of view, its outline faint but unmistakable. I spun around. Nothing. I was alone. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? They wouldn't believe me. But that night, I stayed awake, watching every creak and groan of the house. The door remained locked, but I could feel it. Something was still out there, watching. We left the next morning, eager to put the cabin behind us. But when we returned home, I received a message from Mark. He had gone back to the cabin alone a week later to retrieve something he'd forgotten. When he went inside, everything seemed fine until he found something strange on the kitchen counter. There was a note. It read, "You were never supposed to leave." He never went back. To this day, I have no idea what was at that cabin. But I know one thing for sure, we weren't the only ones there. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the grind. My friends and I rented a secluded cabin in the woods, far from civilization, expecting nothing more than fresh air and quiet nights. What we got was far from peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when we unloaded our gear. The cabin looked like something out of a horror movie, old, with peeling paint and a crooked porch. But it was spacious and isolated, and we were eager to escape our hectic lives. The first night was uneventful. We cooked, laughed, and played games around the fire pit. The woods were quiet, almost quiet. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, but I thought nothing of it. It was just the isolation. Around midnight, we decided to head inside. I was in the bedroom on the second floor, alone. The others had their own rooms, and I preferred the privacy. I could hear them talking downstairs, but their voices were soon drowned out by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was soft at first, almost like a branch tapping against the window. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more rhythmic, like something or someone was scraping at the wall outside. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed deliberate, as if it were trying to get my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up in bed, listening. It was closer now, right outside the window. A loud thud made me jump. Then came a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was close. Too close. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and pressed my face to the glass. The night was pitch black, no moon, no stars. I saw nothing, only shadows and trees. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, terrified. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I was alone upstairs, and the rest of my friends were downstairs, too far away to hear anything. What if it was someone playing a prank? But the voice sounded wrong, too low, too guttural. I grabbed my phone to call one of my friends, but I had no signal. Panic crept in as the voice came again, this time with a low, scraping laugh. I was paralyzed with fear. Should I check outside? Should I wake everyone up? I stayed still, straining to hear any sound, but everything fell silent. No wind, no scratching, nothing. I waited in the dark, my ears ringing with the silence. But after what felt like an eternity, the voice came once more, only this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the room. I heard a faint rustling behind me, and I spun around to face the door. The door was slightly ajar, as I had left it when I went to bed. But now, the space between the door and the frame was too wide, like something was pushing it open from the other side. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I heard the scraping again, this time from the far corner of the room, near the closet. My legs moved before I could even think, and I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and into the living room where the others were still gathered, oblivious to what had happened. I rushed in, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't speak at first, just gasping for air. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, looking at me with concern. I had heard something. Someone outside the window, then inside. I stammered. I could see that my face was pale, and I knew I was shaking. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked skeptically. "You probably just heard an animal. You're freaking out," but I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We all stayed up for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like the cabin was holding its breath. By morning, I convinced myself it was all my imagination. That morning, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. There were long, scratch-like marks on the windowsill. I bent down to look closer, and to my horror, I saw that the marks weren't made by any animal. They were human-shaped, like fingers dragging down the wood. The others didn't notice, and I didn't want to scare them, so I didn't say anything. But as we walked out, I saw the final detail, a handprint pressed against the glass from the outside, smeared with something dark. We left the cabin quickly, and I didn't look back. But to this day, I can't forget that voice, those eyes I never saw, and the feeling that something followed us out of that place. And sometimes, when the wind picks up, I swear I hear a faint whisper, calling me from the dark. I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name, "Let me in." I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time, "Let me in." The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure. Just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. Let me in. I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed that the mirror it was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. We rented the cabin to escape the stress of city life, 4 of us in total. It was deep in the woods, miles away from any kind of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The cabin was rustic but cozy, surrounded by thick trees that made the outside world feel miles away. We spent the first evening around the fire pit, laughing and telling stories. As night settled in, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. I've always been sensitive to quiet places, but this felt different. There was something pressing on the air, something just under the surface of the normal sounds of nature. That night, I went to bed early. The others stayed up, but I felt exhausted. I tucked myself into the cozy bed and tried to drift off, but the silence was unsettling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise. At first, it was faint, barely a whisper. A scratching sound like nails against wood. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I lay perfectly still, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But then the scratching came again, louder, closer. It was unmistakable, as if something or someone was moving just outside my door. I turned my head slowly, my breath shallow. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was the scraping against the wood. I held my breath and listened, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lay there for what felt like forever, wondering if I should check it out. The rational part of my brain told me it was nothing, the wind, maybe, or an animal. But that voice in my head, the one that usually told me to calm down, was now silent. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and crept to the door, holding my breath. I peeked through the crack. Nothing. The hallway was dark, but still, I opened the door fully and tiptoed out, my heart racing. The house felt colder now, like something had changed. The air seemed heavier. I walked toward the stairs, intending to check on my friends, but then I froze. At the bottom of the stairs, a shadow moved across the wall, its outline barely visible in the faint light from the living room. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow grew clearer, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, moving slowly across the room. I backed away, but my foot caught on the edge of the floor. The figure stopped and turned toward me. For a split second, I thought I saw its face, a twisted, hollow thing, with black pits where I should be. And then, just as quickly, the figure vanished into thin air. I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to calm my breathing. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was I just tired? The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent me into a state of panic. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake again by a loud bang. This time, it came from downstairs, followed by muffled footsteps, as though someone was moving around the cabin. I didn't dare leave my room again. I texted my friends, but there was no reply. The silence from downstairs was almost worse than the noise. What was happening? What had been in that room with me? At dawn, I ventured downstairs, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. The living room was just as I had left it, except for one thing: the front door was wide open. I ran outside and looked around, my heart hammering. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having come or gone. The door was locked when we arrived, and I was certain none of us had opened it. When the others finally woke up, I told them what had happened. They thought I was just scared, maybe imagining things. But when we went outside later, we found something strange: deep scratches, like claw marks, along the front of the cabin, leading to the door. We didn't stay another night. As we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us to leave. The woods seemed darker now, more oppressive. I looked over my shoulder once more, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, and the faint whisper of wind in the branches. I don't know what was in that cabin, but whatever it was, it wanted us to leave. And I'm sure it's still out there, waiting for the next people foolish enough to venture into the woods. I've always been the type to question everything. Ghost stories, folklore, I never bought into it. But all of that changed one night when I went on a camping trip with my friends. We decided to head out to a remote spot deep in the woods. No signal, no distractions, just a place to disconnect and unwind. I didn't know much about the area, but my friend Adam, who organized the trip, assured us it was perfect. Isolated, quiet, peaceful, he'd said. It sounded great. We arrived late, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, and quickly set up our tents by a small clearing. The air was crisp, and there was an eerie stillness that blanketed the woods. The fire crackled as we sat around it, laughing and telling stories. But, as the night dragged on, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the kind of stillness you associate with peace. It was a thick, oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on you. Around midnight, we all retired to our tents. I had trouble sleeping, the quiet gnawing at me like a weight on my chest. At some point, I heard what I thought was someone walking around outside my tent. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something, but then came a sound that froze me cold, a soft knock on my tent. I held my breath. I couldn't believe it. The knock came again, slower this time, more deliberate. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, not daring to move. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a whisper, "Let me in." I nearly suffocated on my own breath. The voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but clear enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a woman's voice, thin and breathless, like it was coming from just outside the tent. My mind raced. Could it be one of my friends? I waited, counting the seconds before I unzipped the tent, but before I could, the whisper came again, this time closer. "Let me in." I quickly checked my phone. No signal. I didn't know what to do. So, just stayed there, frozen in place. The knocking stopped, but the whispering didn't. It lingered, filling the space around me. I wanted to scream, but the fear locked my throat. After what felt like hours, the whispers faded, and the night returned to its suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to every movement in the forest, wondering if someone was out there. When morning came, I was drained, but I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but when I emerged from my tent, I noticed something. The ground around our campsite was disturbed, footprints leading in a circle, as if someone had been walking around our tents all night. And they weren't human. The shape of the prints was all wrong, too large, too deep. I didn't tell the others about what had happened. But Adam, ever the skeptic, had a theory. He had read some stuff about the area, he said. It was an old legend about a woman who had gone missing in these woods. She was said to roam the forest, looking for anyone foolish enough to venture near. The way Adam described it sounded ridiculous, but as he talked, I began to feel like I was being watched again. We spent the rest of the day exploring the woods, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But that night, the feeling returned. We gathered around the campfire, but none of us spoke much. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something was about to happen. And then it did. From the woods, we heard a rustling. It started faint, but then grew louder, closer. My heart pounded as I turned to the others, but no one had heard it. Adam was already standing, flashlight in hand. He was about to speak when a shadow moved just outside the circle of light. I saw it clearly. A figure, hunched over, moving quickly among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with its face hidden in shadow. It stopped for a moment, and in that instant, the air grew colder. Then, it disappeared into the dark. We didn't hesitate. We packed up everything and rushed to the car. No one said a word, but I could feel the fear settling in. As we drove away, I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. A week later, Adam sent me a message. He had done some more research about the area. The missing woman, he said, had been found years later, wandering the same woods. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her last words were, "They're still out there, waiting." I can't explain it, but that night, whatever we saw in the woods, it wasn't human, and I don't think it ever left. I've seen a lot of strange things, animals behaving oddly, signs of storms that seemed to form out of nowhere, but nothing could prepare me for the night I had last spring. That night, I realized how much the forest hides from us. It all started as a routine patrol. The weather was turning cold, and I was assigned to a more isolated part of the park, an area where few people ventured. There was a small cabin near the trailhead, and my job was to check that everything was secure, ensuring no one had been up to mischief. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. As I made my way down the winding path, the trees were dense, blocking most of the fading daylight. The usual noises of the forest had quieted, which struck me as odd. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt like the woods were holding their breath. The birds, the wind, even the rustling of leaves had all faded. I reached the cabin just as night was beginning to fall. The air had turned chilly, and a dense fog began rolling in. I walked around the perimeter, checked the windows, and made sure the door was locked. The place felt abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to the front of the cabin, ready to head back when I heard a noise behind me, something subtle, but distinct. A faint scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight flickered as I tried to peer through the fog and the cabin's windows. There was no movement, but that sound continued, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I took a few cautious steps back toward the cabin door, considering my options. The scraping sound continued, now joined by a soft thumping. It was almost rhythmic, like footsteps. I had to check. I pulled out my keys and hesitated for just a second before unlocking the door. I swung it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The inside of the cabin was empty. No animals, no intruders, just dust and old furniture. But the scraping sound. It stopped the moment I stepped inside. I shined my flashlight across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something strange. The floorboards, they were new. I'd been in this cabin many times before, and the floor had always been worn, creaking underfoot. But now, the boards looked fresh, freshly laid, and unnaturally smooth. My heart started racing. I knelt down to examine the floor more closely, and that's when I saw a small, jagged crack at the edge of one of the boards. Something was behind it. I used my flashlight to peer into the crack and saw a flash of white. I leaned in closer, instinctively reaching out to touch the crack. That's when the scraping sound returned. It was louder this time, right behind me, coming from just inside the walls. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, but every instinct screamed at me to run. The scraping didn't stop, and now there was a low, guttural breathing sound coming from within the walls of the cabin. One had to get out of there. I backed toward the door, fumbling for my keys, but before I could turn the handle, the breathing stopped. And then, something much worse happened. The floorboards beneath me creaked, but not in the usual way. It was as if something heavy was moving below the ground, crawling beneath the floor. I stepped back, my flashlight casting a trembling beam across the cabin. Then, with a sickening crack, the floorboard where I had been kneeling snapped upward. I jumped back, terrified, but nothing emerged from the hole. The scraping had stopped, and all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I didn't wait another second. I rushed out of the cabin, slammed the door shut, and sprinted back down the trail, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. It wasn't until the next morning that I returned with a colleague to investigate the cabin. We pried up the floorboards, expecting to find the usual critters or perhaps an old forgotten stash of supplies. Instead, we found a hole beneath the floor, but no signs of any animals. What we did find were several old, decayed personal items, clothes, shoes, and a faded journal. It looked like someone had lived there once, but there was no record of any other park rangers ever having occupied the cabin. As I flipped through the journal, the last entry sent a cold chill through me. It's not just the trees that watch. Something else is out there, waiting for us to leave. We never spoke about that night again. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I, Rachel, Tom, and Jake, had been planning our camping trip for weeks. We chose a remote site deep in the woods, far away from city lights and noise, promising ourselves a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The air was crisp when we arrived, the sun shining bright overhead as we set up our tents by a small, glimmering lake. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and a little unnerving. After a while, Rachel suggested we play a game of truth or dare, which seemed harmless enough. We laughed, teased each other, and drank a few beers while the fire crackled. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest and muffling the sounds of the night. The laughter died down, and a strange quiet settled over us, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. Hey, did anyone else feel that? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Feel what? He said. The thrill of camping. Come on, we're fine. We decided to head to our tents for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Suddenly, I heard something else, a faint whispering that seemed to float through the air. I sat up, straining to listen. The voices were indistinct, but they felt close, too close. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel, I whispered, not wanting to alarm her. Do you hear that? She groaned and pulled the sleeping bag over her head. Hear what? Just go to sleep. But I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt compelled to get out of my tent. I unzipped it quietly and stepped out, the cool air hitting my skin. The fog was thick, swirling around me, and the fire had died down to embers, casting dim, flickering shadows. I turned toward the woods where the whispers seemed to come from. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently. I felt drawn to them, as if the whispers were calling my name. Just as I took a step forward, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to find Jake standing there, looking equally bewildered. Did you hear it too? He asked, his eyes wide with fear. Yeah, I replied, glancing back toward the trees. It's coming from over there. We stood there for a moment, caught between curiosity and dread. When Tom and Rachel emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. What's going on? Tom asked, rubbing his eyes. We heard voices, I explained, and as I did, the whispers intensified, almost as if they were responding to us. The four of us stood together, the fear palpable in the air. Suddenly, as if on cue, the whispers faded, and a silence fell over the woods. We looked at each other, our breaths visible in the chilly night air. Let's get back to the fire, Rachel said, her voice shaky. We hurried back, relieved to be in the warmth of the remaining embers. As we sat together, the tension slowly eased, though we couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us that night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we all crawled back into our tents, vowing to leave early in the morning. When dawn broke, we packed up quickly, eager to escape the strange occurrences of the night before. We drove home with a sense of relief, but deep down, I knew the forest held secrets I would never understand. To this day, I wonder what those whispers meant and if they were meant for us at all. I thought I had chosen the perfect spot for our weekend camping trip, deep in the woods where we could escape the city and embrace nature. My friends and I, excited and eager, set up camp as dusk fell. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sounds of wildlife. It felt magical, a perfect escape from our mundane lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Laughter echoed through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt right. But, as the stars began to twinkle above, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest felt alive, and not just with the usual sounds of nature. Something else lingered in the air, a palpable tension that made my skin prickle. Jenna, my adventurous friend, suggested a night hike. She had a knack for dragging us into questionable situations, and tonight was no different. Fueled by curiosity and the lingering adrenaline from the campfire, we agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light flickering over twisted branches and the underbrush. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but Jenna kept pushing forward, excited by the thrill of the unknown. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a series of frantic wrestlings. My heart raced as we turned to face the direction of the noise. Fear clawed at my throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dim light of our flashlights. It was a man, covered in dirt and leaves, his eyes wild and desperate. He stumbled toward us, breathing heavily, chains dragging behind him. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out. Panic surged within me, and I grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her back. We stumbled over each other as we ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We ducked into a thicket of bushes, hearts pounding, praying we were hidden. From our hiding spot, we watched as the man continued to pace, his chains rattling. Then we noticed the lights. Tiny, flickering lanterns began to dot the forest floor, slowly illuminating a group of figures approaching from the shadows. They moved with an unnatural grace, their faces obscured by masks, their bodies swathed in tattered cloth. Each one held a lantern, casting an eerie glow that danced around the trees. I could barely breathe as they surrounded the man, whispering in hushed tones. The air grew thick with tension, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was sure they had come for him. I squeezed Jenna's hand, fear tightening its grip on us. It felt like a nightmare, surreal and horrifying. The figures began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody that resonated through the trees. The man's eyes widened in terror as he struggled against his chains, but it was useless. They closed in around him, and the air turned electric with anticipation. In that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a mix of terror and dread. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, their mask glinting in the lantern light, and I saw the empty eye sockets staring directly at me. I gasped and instinctively ducked lower, but not before I caught a glimpse of something chilling. The man wasn't just a victim, he was one of them. As the figures pulled him into their midst, he transformed before our eyes, joining their ranks, chains wrapping around him like a second skin. They began to move away, dragging him along, their lanterns flickering as they vanished into the darkness. We waited in silence until we were sure they were gone, our hearts still racing. We quietly retraced our steps back to camp, too terrified to speak. When we arrived, I gasped in horror. Our campsite was destroyed, tents slashed, supplies scattered, the fire smoldering, but the worst part was the message etched into the ground in what looked like dirt and ash. You should have joined us. We didn't look back as we packed our things and sprinted to the car, desperate to escape the forest grip. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the chains rattling in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the shadows. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. But I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. I was working the night shift as a park ranger, a job I had loved since I began. It was late October, and the forest had a magical quality about it, with the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold. That night, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I had just finished checking the trails and was preparing to return to the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. A voice emerged, shaky and frightened. It was a family camping about a mile deep in the woods. They said they heard something outside their tent, something big that had been pacing around for hours. I could hear the panic in the father's voice, urging me to come quickly. I reassured him, telling him it was probably just a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down the winding path, hoping to ease their fears. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound of my boots crunching on fallen twigs was the only noise accompanying me. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and I called out to the family as I approached their campsite. The tent stood eerily still, the only movement coming from the wind tugging at the flaps. My heart raced as I called out again, but there was no response. The father had promised they would be awake, but it was as if the night had swallowed them whole. I stepped closer and noticed the tent zipper was slightly open. Something was off. I cautiously unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags lay sprawled across the ground, still warm, but there was no sign of the family. Panic surged through me as I stepped back and scanned the area. That's when I heard a low growl emanating from the trees. It was not an animal's growl. It sounded human, guttural and strained. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, heart pounding as I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the shadows. It looked like a man, but was far too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. It didn't walk. It glided toward me, its eyes reflecting the light like two coals burning in the night. I stumbled backward, fear gripping me as it stepped closer. I spun around and bolted back down the path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps that echoed behind me. I dashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. I dared not look back, focusing instead on the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness ahead. As I neared the main trail, I could feel the figure closing in. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears. I burst onto the main road, my breath ragged. Just as I thought I was safe, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard onto the dirt, the flashlight skidding away from my grasp. The growl was deafening now, a horrible cacophony of rage and desperation. I scrambled to my feet and reached for the flashlight, but as my fingers closed around the cool metal, I felt a hot breath on my neck. I froze, terror coursing through my body. With a sudden rush of instinct, I turned and swung the flashlight behind me, shining the beam into the face of my pursuer. But it wasn't the terrifying creature I expected. Instead, it was a deer doe with big, frightened eyes. It stood frozen, staring at me, seemingly just as scared as I was. I stood there, bewildered, the growling sound fading into the night. It dawned on me that the family had probably packed up and left in fear. I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts, glancing around. There were no signs of the creature, just the rustling leaves and the gentle sway of the trees. When I made my way back to the ranger station, I realized that sometimes our minds can conjure the most terrifying monsters. In the stillness of the woods, fear had twisted my perception of reality. The shadows played tricks on me, and the fears of the night had become a tangible monster. Yet, as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Something lurked beyond the trees, just out of sight, reminding me that the dark holds more than just the fear of what we see. It also contains the shadows of our imagination. I have always loved the solitude of the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days monitoring trails, maintaining campsites, and ensuring that everyone enjoyed their time in nature safely. One chilly autumn evening, I was assigned the last shift of the season, just as the leaves were starting to fall and the air turned crisp. Little did I know that this night would change my perspective on the forest forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set out on my usual patrol. The trees towered over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, a sound that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt ominous. I had always been aware of the stories the locals spoke of strange happenings in these woods, whispers of creatures lurking just beyond the trees. I never paid them much mind, chalking it up to urban legends meant to scare children. About an hour into my shift, I noticed something unusual. Off the main trail, a flickering light danced through the trees. My curiosity piqued. I cautiously approached, thinking it might be a group of campers in need of help. As I got closer, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. As I turned back to the path, I heard a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I glanced over my shoulder, but the forest was still. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks. However, the feeling of being watched pressed heavily on my chest. I continued my patrol, but the unease lingered. As I approached the campsite where a family was staying, I noticed their tent was zipped shut, and the campfire was still burning, casting flickering shadows. I called out to them, but there was no response. I stepped closer, peering inside the tent, and saw it empty, with no sign of the family. My heart raced. Where could they have gone? Just then, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a chilling scream. The sound came from deeper in the woods, sending my adrenaline into overdrive. I sprinted towards the source, fear gripping my heart. Each step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. Waiting. As I reached a small clearing, I stumbled upon something terrifying. The ground was torn up, as if a massive animal had been digging frantically. The scream had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my beam cutting through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and the scattered remnants of what looked like a picnic, broken plates, an overturned cooler. Then I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My heart raced as I called out again, this time louder. The shadow paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. It vanished before I could process what I had seen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned to flee back towards the trail. In my panic, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard a low growl emanating from the darkness. It sounded closer now. My instincts kicked in, and I ran, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I had to get back to my truck, back to safety. Finally, I burst out onto the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back, scanning the shadows. Nothing followed. I reached my truck, fumbling for the keys as the growl echoed in my mind. Just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The family had thought was missing stood just outside the tree line. They appeared disheveled, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. I leapt out, relieved they were safe. As I approached, I noticed something behind them. The twisted figure I had seen earlier was standing silently, its grotesque form illuminated by the headlights of my truck. But instead of lunging at us, it simply stood there, watching. The family had been lost, but had found their way back when they heard the scream, which was not their own, but rather a warning to escape. The creature, whatever it was, had been trying to protect them from something far worse lurking deeper in the woods. We stood together in shock, realizing that sometimes the real monsters are the unseen forces that drive fear into our hearts. With the morning light creeping in, we hurried out of the woods, grateful to have survived the night, but forever haunted by what we had encountered in the shadows. Camping in the deep woods had always been my escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I often went with a group of friends, but this time, I found myself alone. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet of nature, and maybe indulge in a little stargazing. Little did I know how the night would unfold. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, a perfect spot nestled between tall pines and a clear, babbling brook. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, almost as if nature was welcoming me. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared some snacks as the sky shifted from orange to deep indigo. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing, just a blank screen. I chuckled at my lack of foresight. No calls, no texts, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of sitting by the fire, I decided to take a walk. I wandered along the edge of the brook, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the trees. I froze, straining to identify the source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was similar to someone lightly banging a stick against a tree. Curious, I decided to follow it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the tapping grew louder, and with it came an unsettling feeling that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. I turned back toward the campsite, but paused when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood still, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was just a dark silhouette. Panic surged within me, and I took a step back. The figure moved, its outline blurring as it stepped further into the darkness, disappearing completely. I turned on my heel and ran back to the fire. My pulse pounding in my ears, I collapsed into my camping chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I reassured myself that it was probably just an animal, but the fear gnawed at me. The fire crackled loudly, illuminating the surrounding trees and keeping the darkness at bay, but my unease lingered. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to poke the fire and try to shake off the dread. Just as I did, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart sank. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. I felt like a child again, afraid of the monsters lurking in the dark. As I sat there, a movement caught my eye from the corner of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, this time much closer. I stood up abruptly, ready to confront whatever it was. The flashlight beam revealed a woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hands, trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What happened?" I asked, stepping forward. "They're coming for me," she stammered, looking over her shoulder. "I don't know what they want, but they won't stop." My instincts kicked in, and I gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here." "Who is coming?" Just then, I heard it again, the rhythmic tapping, now closer than before. The woman's eyes widened further, and she let out a small whimper. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I glanced into the darkness, the tapping now turning into a chorus of discordant knocks. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if something had passed through the light. I turned to look at the woman, but she had vanished. My heart dropped, and I stumbled back, casting the flashlight all around me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as panic set in. Then I heard her voice, echoing from the darkness. "They're here." I stumbled back to the tent, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me. As I unzipped the door and stepped inside, I took a breath to steady myself. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them, the scene had changed. My campsite was now empty, devoid of any trace of my tent or the fire. All that remained was a crude drawing etched into the dirt where my campfire once burned. It reads simply, "We will find you." I stumbled back, realizing I wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping returned, echoing through the trees, but this time I was not the one being hunted. I had become part of their twisted game, and the night was just beginning. It was the summer of my sophomore year in college when my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote area of the national park. The thrill of the outdoors always excited us, and we wanted a break from our studies. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, Lisa, and Mark. We drove up Friday afternoon, eager to pitch our tents by a tranquil lake surrounded by towering pine trees. After setting up camp, we spent the day hiking and swimming. As the sun began to set, we gathered around a crackling campfire, roasting hot dogs and telling stories. It felt perfect, the warmth of the fire, the laughter of my friends, and the stunning view of the stars above. As night enveloped us, an unusual chill crept into the air. Lisa, always the superstitious one, brought up the tales she had heard about this particular forest, how people claimed to hear voices at night. We laughed it off, but as the night wore on, the forest grew eerily quiet. The crickets and frogs fell silent, replaced by a strange stillness that sent shivers down my spine. Just as I began to shake off the unease, I heard a faint whispering coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. It sounded like children giggling, but mixed with something darker, something that sent chills through me. I glanced at Jake and Lisa. They had heard it too? Mark, however, was oblivious, engrossed in his phone. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely breaking the silence. Jake nodded, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" We turned off our flashlights, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the trees. They sounded close, but we couldn't see anything. Lisa suggested we move closer to the edge of the camp, where the forest began. Against my better judgment, we followed her, curiosity pushing us forward. As we ventured a few yards beyond the fire, the whispering suddenly stopped. An unsettling silence replaced it, making the hairs on my arms stand up. We stood there for a moment, peering into the darkness, when Mark finally noticed something strange. "Hey, guys, look," he said, pointing into the shadows. In the distance, we saw a faint glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. It flickered and danced among the trees. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was out there was not just a figment of our imagination. "Should we go back?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, let's head back," I replied, feeling a surge of adrenaline. We turned to walk back to the fire, but the moment we did, the whispers returned, now sounding closer and more urgent. It was as if the forest was trying to communicate with us, urging us to come closer. Suddenly, the glow vanished, plunging us back into darkness. Panic set in, and we quickened our pace, rushing back to the safety of our campfire. Once we reached it, we huddled together, the warmth of the fire feeling like our only defense against the unknown. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire. We stayed up for a few more hours, keeping watch until the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky. When morning finally broke, the forest looked completely normal, the sun filtering through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. Though nothing truly sinister had happened, we all felt a lingering dread about the whispers and the mysterious glow. We packed our things and left early, eager to return to the safety of our everyday lives. That trip stayed with us, a reminder of how the woods can feel alive, holding secrets we may never understand. A group of us, close friends from college, had made the trek to a remote camping spot we'd heard about from a local guide. It was tucked deep into the forest, miles away from any roads, a place that felt almost untouched by civilization. The first night went by without incident. We set up camp, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories around the fire. The weather was cool, the sky clear, and the sounds of the forest were oddly calming. The air smelled fresh, the kind of wilderness aroma you can only experience when you're far from human habitation. After a while, we retired to our tents, falling asleep to the rustling of leaves in the trees. But the second night felt different. Something about the woods seemed off. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, but then I realized that I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps, light but deliberate, moving just outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make sense of the sound. My friend Jake was beside me, still asleep. I couldn't wake him. I didn't want to scare him, and I was too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped, and the night fell silent again, but my unease didn't subside. Something was out there, something moving in the darkness, watching us. I lay still, counting the seconds, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature, passing by. But then, I heard it, a low whisper. It came from just beyond the tent, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakable in its intent. The whispering voice sounded like it was calling my name. I was certain of it. I waited until the whisper faded before slowly unzipping the tent. I peered outside, scanning the area, but the campfire had long since gone out, and the woods were bathed in darkness. There was no movement, no sound, just the eerie quiet of the forest at night. But something caught my eye, something that made my stomach twist in knots. Near the edge of the camp, just outside the light's reach, I saw a figure standing motionless, its back to me. It was tall and thin, with ragged clothes that looked like they'd been worn for years. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of a person. They weren't moving, they weren't even breathing. It was as though they were waiting for something, or someone. I had to act. I grabbed Jake and shook him awake, whispering frantically for him to stay quiet. We weren't alone. But when we both looked back toward the figure, it was gone. I don't know how long we stood there, but when we dared to move, it felt like every sound in the forest was amplified. The crackling of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches swaying in the wind, it all felt like a threat. We decided to wake the others. No one argued when we suggested packing up and leaving. As we gathered our things, the whispers returned, faint but insistent. They seemed to follow us, circling our camp, getting louder with every step we took toward the wood's edge. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were multiple voices, all murmuring in low tones, just out of reach. The hike back to the car was unnerving, each rustle in the trees making us jump. But it wasn't until we reached the clearing near the trail head that we felt the true weight of the situation. There, in the moonlight, stood a line of figures, tall, thin, all wearing the same tattered clothes. They were more than we had seen before. They were standing perfectly still, as though they had been waiting for us the entire time. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my ears, but I didn't want to look away. I could feel their eyes on us, even though I couldn't see their faces. It was like they were staring right into our souls. Then, as if on cue, they all turned their heads in unison. And at that exact moment, we heard the most chilling sound, a child's laughter, clear and high-pitched, echoing from the woods. And that's when we understood. Those figures, those voices, they weren't human. They were something else, something that had been waiting for us, something that fed off our fear. The child's laughter wasn't just eerie, it was mocking. It was as if they were toying with us, waiting to see how long it would take for us to realize that we were never supposed to leave the woods. We ran. We didn't look back, and when we reached the car, I thought it was over. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of eyes staring at me from the back seat, reflecting in the darkened glass. They were the eyes of a child. That was the last time I ever set foot in those woods. And I know now that some things are better left unexplored. Because in those forests, the trees aren't the only thing that watches you. We'd been planning it for months, eager to disconnect from everything. The plan was to reach a remote spot deep in the forest, camp for a night, and hike out the next morning. The first day went perfectly. We hiked for hours, the trees growing denser as we made our way deeper into the woods. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled our lungs. By the time we reached the clearing we'd picked for the night, the sun was beginning to set. The silence of the forest was so thick it felt almost suffocating. We set up camp near a small stream, the sound of the water soothing against the backdrop of stillness. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and we huddled around the campfire, talking and laughing, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. Something about the place felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The woods felt too quiet, too untouched by human presence. After a while, we turned in for the night. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. The darkness outside was so thick it felt suffocating. I lay there for what seemed like hours, listening to the wind rustling the leaves and the distant sound of water. It was peaceful, but that nagging feeling still wouldn't leave. Then I heard it. A faint, distant rustling. It sounded like footsteps, crunching slowly through the underbrush. I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Was someone else in the woods with us? I strained my ears, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I waited, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate step, then another. Someone or something was moving through the woods near our camp. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, but something didn't feel right. The steps were too deliberate, too methodical. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, shining the beam out into the darkness. Nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that was short-lived. The rustling continued, now circling the camp. I quickly crawled out of the tent, heart pounding, and whispered to my friends to stay quiet. We sat in the dark, listening, our nerves taut, trying to make sense of the sounds. The air was still now, not a sound to be heard except for the distant howl of a coyote. We huddled together, the campfire flickering weakly. Then, a twig snapped in the darkness, loud and sharp. Right outside the circle of light, we all turned toward the noise, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness, but there was nothing, just shadows and trees. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I turned back to my friends, trying to stay calm, but the look in their eyes mirrored my own panic. Then, from behind one of the trees, I saw just for a second a figure standing motionless in the shadows, taller than any man, its outline barely visible in the dark. I blinked and it was gone, vanished into the woods. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack and started toward the trail. I wasn't waiting around to find out what that thing was. My friends followed quickly, fear making us move faster than we should have, stumbling through the underbrush. We didn't stop until we reached the road, breathless and shaken. The next day, we returned to the spot to pack up our gear. As we were cleaning up, one of my friends found something strange, a piece of cloth, torn and ragged, caught on a low-hanging branch. It wasn't part of any of our gear. It was dark, almost black, and felt wrong to the touch. We kept our distance, but the unease followed us the whole way back to the car. The woods were silent again, but there was something in the air that I couldn't shake. We made it back to the car and left as quickly as we could. Weeks later, we talked about the trip. We shared our experiences, trying to make sense of what had happened. Then one of my friends, who had taken the photos, mentioned something. In one of the pictures, a blurry figure was standing just outside the firelight, almost invisible in the shadows. It was the same figure we had seen, the one that had vanished so quickly into the trees. And when we zoomed in on the photo, we noticed something strange. Its face. It wasn't human. We never went back to those woods, and we never spoke about it again. But every time I think about that trip, I still hear the footsteps in the distance, following us, just out of sight. And now, I can't help but wonder if the thing we saw was ever really gone. We had always talked about doing something different for our annual camping trip. After years of sticking to the same familiar spots, we decided to head deep into the woods, somewhere we'd never been before. The kind of place where you don't hear anything but the wind and your own thoughts. We thought it would be peaceful, a way to disconnect. But it turned out to be the opposite. We set up camp in a dense patch of forest, surrounded by trees so thick the sunlight barely made it through. It felt like we were in another world, quiet, isolated, and eerie. As we pitched our tents and gathered firewood, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. But, I told myself, it was just the unfamiliar setting playing tricks on my mind. By evening, the air had grown colder, and the forest seemed even more still. We sat around the fire, telling stories and making jokes to keep the mood light. But, as the fire began to die down, I started hearing strange noises, twigs snapping, something brushing against the trees. But it didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, like someone or something was moving around us. My friends didn't seem to notice, laughing and poking fun at my nervousness. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. But then, I heard it again, a soft, whispering voice that came from somewhere beyond the firelight. It was faint but clear enough for me to make out. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced around the circle of friends. No one else seemed to have heard it. The whisper was so soft that it could have been my imagination, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept quiet, forcing myself to focus on the conversation. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, as if moving closer to us. "Help me." I stood up abruptly, scanning the shadows in the trees. The others noticed my sudden tension and stopped talking, looking at me in confusion. I felt a rush of cold air around me, and for a moment, the forest seemed to go completely still. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing, just silence. Before I could say anything, there was a loud snap of branches behind us. We all turned, eyes wide. There, just beyond the firelight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its shape barely visible in the darkness. The figure stood completely still, just watching us. We were too far from the car, and there was no way we could outrun whatever it was. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it staring directly at me. The whispering began again, louder now. But it wasn't coming from the figure, it was coming from every direction. "Help me, help me, help me." The voice echoed around us, and the air felt thick with it. We all stood frozen, unsure of whether to run or confront whatever was out there. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, and we all jumped back, hearts racing. The figure was gone. The whispering stopped instantly. We stood in a circle, breathing heavily, unable to move. The only sound now was our own panicked breathing. I felt a cold hand grip my heart as I realized the figure hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere, just out of sight. We decided to pack up and leave. But as we began gathering our things, the air grew even colder, and the forest seemed to close in on us. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And every time we looked over our shoulders, the figure was there again, just out of sight, always lurking in the shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The drive back was silent, none of us daring to speak about what had happened. We had escaped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Even as we left the woods behind. It wasn't until I was unloading my things that I noticed something strange. In one of the pictures we had taken that night, there was a figure standing in the background, just behind the trees, barely visible. It was the same shape, the same tall, thin figure, but there was something different about it. In the photo, it was smiling. That's when I realized the truth. The figure hadn't been just a part of the forest. It was never far from us. It had always been watching. I never thought much about haunted houses or strange occurrences. I was always the one to brush off stories, but everything changed during a trip with some friends a few years ago. We decided to rent a secluded cabin for the weekend, far away from any city lights or distractions. It seemed like the perfect escape, peaceful, quiet, surrounded by trees. The first night was fine. We settled in, made dinner, and started telling ghost stories by the fire. I wasn't scared until we heard something strange. Around midnight, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. It was a rhythmic, slow tapping, like someone knocking. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a little louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up to check, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, tapping, soft and persistent. Then, a voice, a faint whisper. It said my name, Sarah. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but it was empty, still. The whispering stopped as soon as I looked out the window, but I felt something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. When morning came, I didn't tell anyone. They'd all laugh at me, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But that evening, as we sat around the fire, one of my friends, Jake, casually mentioned hearing the same tapping the night before. Then, Emma spoke up. She'd heard the whispering too, only she thought it was just a dream. We all went silent. Maybe it's an animal, Mark said, trying to ease the tension. But we were all on edge now, aware of the strange sounds that had plagued us. Later that night, I decided to check the window again. Maybe I could convince myself it was just the wind or something. As I walked to the window, I felt a cold draft sweep across my skin. I pulled the curtain back, but the tapping was there again, like it was coming from just beyond the glass. I gasped, backing away, my mind racing. Then, I noticed something else. There was a shadow moving outside. It was too dark to make out details, but it wasn't the shape of a person, it was too fluid, like it was slithering, creeping around the cabin. I rushed to wake the others. We stood in the living room, staring out the windows, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shadow moved in circles around the cabin, and then it stopped right at the front door. There was no knock, just an intense silence that filled the space. We waited, holding our breath. And then, the door creaked open on its own, slowly, as if someone or something had entered. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't supposed to open like that. We rushed to the door, and as we stepped outside, we saw what had been circling the cabin. Footprints. Large, uneven prints, leading toward the woods. Something had been out there, watching us, moving around the cabin. But what terrified me most wasn't the footprints, it was the set of prints that led right back to the door. Whoever, or whatever it was, had been right inside with us, watching, waiting. We didn't stay the next night. We packed up quickly and left, too frightened to even consider staying any longer. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Something was in that cabin with us. Something that moved without a sound, waited without a breath, and followed us back home. The question still lingers in my mind, is it still waiting? A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house were creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in," I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank, I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped, the voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it, who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually, but the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before. But there they were, deep. Jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others, and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again. It started as a simple road trip. My friends and I had planned to drive through some scenic back roads, far from the city, to escape the monotony of daily life. There were 4 of us in total, packed into a single car, with snacks and playlists ready to fill the hours. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that comes easily when you're surrounded by people who know you best. As evening fell, we realized we had underestimated the distance between stops. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and we hadn't seen another car or building in hours. The GPS signal had dropped, leaving us navigating by instinct and the dim headlights. The road narrowed, lined by towering trees that seemed to close in on us the further we drove. When we finally spotted an old gas station, the relief in the car was palpable. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The sign was rusted, and the single pump looked ancient. But the lights inside the small convenience store were on, casting a weak yellow glow into the darkness. One of my friends, let's call him Alex, volunteered to check it out while we stayed behind to stretch our legs. We watched Alex disappear through the door, the light swallowing him up. The air outside was cold, and an unsettling quiet settled over the area. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I glanced at the trees, their shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light of the car's headlights. Alex returned a few minutes later, looking uneasy. He said there was a man behind the counter who hadn't spoken a word, just stared at him while he paid for the gas. He'd filled up the tank already. So, we piled back into the car, eager to leave. As we drove away, I glanced back at the gas station. The man Alex mentioned was standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was pale, almost skeletal, and his eyes seemed to reflect the headlights like an animal's. I turned back around, heart pounding, But I didn't say anything. The road ahead became even narrower, and the trees seemed thicker, their branches hanging low as if trying to trap us. The mood in the car shifted from lighthearted to tense as we drove deeper into the forest. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving us in complete darkness. We sat in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in that we were stranded. Alex tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the soft creak of the cooling engine. We were debating whether to wait or start walking when we heard it a loud, deliberate knock on the car window. It came from my side. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. My friend in the back seat swore she saw something moving just outside her window, but when we all looked, the forest was still. We locked the doors, our breath shallow, hearts racing. Then came the knock again, this time on the rear window. Louder, more forceful. Something scraped along the side of the car, a long, drawn-out sound like nails on metal. We sat frozen, staring into the darkness, when the knocking started again. It moved from window to window, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was circling us. Suddenly, the car's interior lights flickered on, bathing us in harsh yellow light. That's when we saw it, a face pressed against the driver's side window, pale and hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Before any of us could scream, the lights flickered again and went out, leaving us in darkness once more. The knocking stopped. We sat in silence, too scared to move or speak, when the car engine roared to life on its own. The headlights blazed back on, illuminating the road ahead. Without hesitation, Alex slammed on the gas, and we sped down the narrow road. None of us dared to look back. We didn't stop until we reached a town several miles away. When we pulled into a well-lit gas station, the relief was overwhelming. We climbed out of the car, still shaken, and that's when we saw it. Long scratches ran down the length of the car, deep grooves carved into the metal. At the back of the car, smeared in what looked like ash, were handprints. Too large to be human. We never figured out what happened that night. We didn't report it. Who would believe us? But every time I drive through a wooded area, I catch myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see that pale face watching, waiting. And sometimes, just for a split second, I swear I do. I never believed in anything supernatural until that weekend. My friends and I were looking for an escape from our busy lives. So, we rented a cabin far off the beaten path, deep in the woods. It was an old, weathered place, but it seemed cozy enough. I didn't think much of it at first, but looking back, everything about that trip should have sent red flags. The first night was calm. We built a fire, drank, and laughed about old memories. We went to bed around midnight, and that's when the strange sounds began. At first, it was subtle, like a faint scratching on the windows. I assumed it was just branches blowing in the wind, but then it started getting louder. The scraping, almost rhythmic, went on for hours, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. Something was waiting. By 3 a.m., the sounds became more distinct, a soft thud, then another. I got up to check, but when I peeked outside, the woods were eerily still. No wind, no rustling leaves. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The air was too thick, too oppressive. Suddenly, I heard it. A tap, a soft, deliberate knock on my window. My heart leapt into my throat. I slowly crept to the window, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no figure, just the darkness outside. I pulled away from the window, but the knocking came again, louder this time, like something was trying to get my attention. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stayed frozen in place, unable to move. Then came a voice, soft but clear, from just beyond the glass. "Let me in." I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a whisper, low and raspy. It repeated, "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just open the window. I backed away slowly, my breath shaky, and tried to wake my friends. But when I went into the next room, they were all sound asleep, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. I couldn't sleep at all that night. The tapping continued, now moving from window to window, as though something was circling the cabin. I could hear footsteps on the porch, light but deliberate, stopping only to knock again. Each knock felt like a hammer against my chest. Something or someone was out there. When morning came, I didn't tell anyone about the night's events. I didn't want to sound crazy. But when we all gathered in the living room for breakfast, one of my friends, Emily, spoke up. "I heard something last night," she said, her voice shaky. I thought I was imagining it, but I swear I heard knocking. It sounded like it was coming from my window. The others shared similar experiences: tapping, pacing outside, and even a voice. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just the wind or animals. Something had been outside, watching us. We decided to check the area around the cabin to calm our nerves. We walked around the perimeter, our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. When we reached the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the dirt, leading toward the woods. They were large, deeper than any human footprints, and they circled the cabin in a way that made my stomach turn. They didn't look natural. "We need to leave," I said. My voice cracked. None of us felt safe anymore. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. But just as we were about to drive off, I glanced back at the cabin. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the dying light of the day, was a figure, a shadow, tall, unmoving, just standing there, watching us. I gasped, but when I blinked, it was gone. The doorway was empty. My friends didn't see it, but I knew what I had seen. We drove off in silence, not looking back. But the unease stayed with me. It wasn't until later, back at home, that I did some research. I found a local article from decades ago about a woman who had lived alone in a cabin in the woods. She had vanished without a trace. The article mentioned the same strange sounds: scratching, tapping, and a whispering voice reported by several people who had stayed in the area. And at the end of the article, in small print, was a chilling note: "If you hear the tapping at your door, don't answer. She's still out there, waiting." I haven't returned to those woods since. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear a tap on my window, a voice calling me to let it in, and I don't know if I ever will. We never planned on staying at the old inn. It was a last-minute decision, one of those spontaneous trips where you just pick a place and go. My friends and I had rented a cabin a few hours away from the city, hoping for a weekend of peace and fun. When we arrived, though, the place felt wrong. There was something about it, like a faint, suffocating presence in the air that made my skin prickle. The inn looked fine at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. We checked in with the manager, a pale woman with hollow eyes who barely looked up from her desk. She handed us a key and muttered something about the inn being under renovation, but her words barely registered. It wasn't until we reached our room that the unease settled in. The door groaned as we opened it, revealing an oddly furnished space with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered by heavy curtains. It felt like time had stopped there. The air was stifling, thick with something that made me uneasy. That night, we decided to explore the inn. It was late, but curiosity got the best of us. We wandered through the long hallways, the wooden floorboards echoing under our footsteps. The place was eerily quiet, no sounds of other guests, no laughter, no voices, just silence, broken by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then we heard it. A soft, slow tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, this time closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. We reached a door at the end of the hall, one that looked different from the others. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it all the way. We pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, but there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall, one of those large, full-length ones. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I felt a chill run through me, and my friends laughed, thinking it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away quickly, but the tapping sound came again, this time much louder, right outside the door. It was fast now, frantic, like something was desperate to get in. We all rushed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The hall was empty, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt colder, the silence heavier. We walked back toward our room, the tapping following us, echoing down the corridor. My heart raced as we reached our door. The key wouldn't fit into the lock, no matter how many times I tried. It was as if the door itself didn't want us inside. Finally, I pushed the door open with force, and we rushed inside, locking it behind us. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, whispering voice. It was too faint to understand, but it was there scraping at the edges of my mind. I sat on the bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, just a product of the late hour and a creepy atmosphere. But then the room grew unnaturally cold. I looked at the mirror across from me. The reflection was different now. It wasn't me standing there, it was someone else. A figure in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but their eyes were glowing, watching me. The tapping stopped. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Let me out," it whispered. I jumped back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the door to our room creaked open, slowly, on its own. I rushed to shut it, but the door didn't move. It was stuck, like something was holding it from the other side. In the reflection, I saw the figure step toward the door. And then it spoke again, louder now, as if it was right beside me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to my friends, but they were all staring at the mirror, wide-eyed, as though they were seeing the same thing I was. That's when I understood. The inn wasn't just old, it was a trap. The figure, the whispers, the tapping, it was all part of it. Something wanted us to stay, to never leave. We packed up and left the next morning, the sun barely rising, the inn still silent. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Just empty space, surrounded by trees. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that inn didn't want us to leave. And it might be waiting for the next people who wander too close. I never thought a simple apartment would be the place where I'd experience something so terrifying. It started out like any other routine, working long hours, barely having enough time to eat, and coming back to my cramped, inexpensive apartment late at night. The building I lived in wasn't great, but it was cheap. And it was close to my job. It was an old place, with narrow hallways and flickering lights that made me feel like I was in a horror movie. Most of the tenants were quiet, reclusive types, people who just wanted to live in peace without much hassle. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, as if someone had left in a hurry or forgotten to fully close it. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that unease creeping in. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, like it wasn't circulating properly. I closed the door behind me and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Everything seemed in its place, no signs of a break-in, no obvious disturbances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom that I found it. The mirror, it wasn't cracked, but it was smeared. I could see fingerprints along the edges, almost like someone had pressed their hands against it and slowly moved them around, leaving greasy streaks. I didn't know how I didn't notice it earlier. I had been in the bathroom just that morning. I wiped the mirror clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing faint noises, scraping sounds, like nails dragging against the floor. They weren't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear them from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old structure making strange noises, but then I heard something else. A whisper, just outside my door. It was a voice, soft and almost melodic, but it made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't my imagination. It was clear, too real to ignore. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to get closer with every passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, wondering if someone had broken in. But, if they had, why didn't they make a sound when they came in? I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I stood still for a moment, waiting for any sound. The whispering stopped, and I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing. It was just the usual dim lighting and the closed doors of other apartments. But the air felt wrong, colder than usual. As I walked back to my apartment, I glanced toward the elevator. It was an old, creaky thing, but it was never in use at night. Except tonight, it was moving, slowly, the lights flickering as it descended. I froze. The elevator doors opened, and no one was inside. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me for days. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The next morning, I went to the landlord's office to ask about the strange events. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She looked at me with a concerned expression when I mentioned hearing noises and seeing the elevator move on its own. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said, her voice low and almost too calm. "The building has a history." I was about to ask her what she meant when she continued, "People hear things in this place, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the elevator moves by itself. It's just the old pipes. You know, the building settles." She smiled politely, but there was something off about her tone. "Don't worry, though, it's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. That night, the same strange things happened again. The whispering, the scratching, the elevator. But this time, something changed. The whispering wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. It was me, but not me. A distorted, mocking version of my own voice, saying things I hadn't even thought. Things like, "You're still here and it's only just begun." Panicked, I rushed to the bathroom to see if I was imagining things. But then I saw the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. There was a woman standing in my place, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite recognize. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and she was smiling. I stumbled back, almost falling over, and as I turned to run, I heard her voice, clear as day, from behind me. "You're not leaving." It started out as a typical camping trip with my closest friends. We had all been looking forward to this weekend for months: fresh air, good food, and nights spent telling ghost stories around the fire. There were 6 of us, a tight-knit group, heading out to a secluded spot deep in the woods. It was a place we had visited a few times before, always quiet and peaceful. This time, though, something felt off from the start. The sun had just begun to set when we arrived at our campsite. The trees were dense, the air thick with the smell of pine. We set up our tents and unpacked, laughing as we worked. But there was something unnerving about the silence that surrounded us. No birds, no insects, just a heavy, eerie quiet that made my skin prickle. That night, we built a fire. The flames flickered in the dim light, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees around us. We joked and told stories, but the air felt thick, like something was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dark woods stretching out behind our campsite. Around midnight, as the fire began to die down, we heard a noise, something moving through the brush near the edge of our camp. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but quick and deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart started pounding, but I tried to shake it off. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, trying to sound confident, but the footsteps kept coming, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I listened. It was too rhythmic, too precise to be an animal. The others heard it too, and they fell silent. We all turned to look at the edge of the trees where the sound was coming from. For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to suggest we go investigate, a figure appeared at the edge of the FIRELIGHT. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. At first, I thought it was just a person, but as it stepped closer, I realized there was something wrong with it. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its face was completely blank. No expression, no features. It didn't move like a human, its body jerking unnaturally with each step. Panic surged through me. My friends were frozen, unable to speak, too terrified to even breathe. The figure didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at us. I thought I saw its mouth twitch, but I couldn't be sure. And then, Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness without a sound. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to speak. Finally, one of us stood up, voice trembling, saying we should pack up and leave. I agreed immediately, and we hastily gathered our things, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching us from the trees. We drove through the night, barely speaking, all of us on edge, but the feeling of unease never left. It wasn't until the next day, when we were back in the safety of our homes, that the real horror began. I was checking through the photos we had taken during the trip when I noticed something strange in one of the shots. It was a picture of our campsite, taken before the figure appeared. In the background, just at the edge of the firelight, there was a figure tall, thin, and just barely visible, blending into the shadows behind the trees. I had no memory of seeing it when the photo was taken. I showed the others, and they all gasped. They remembered the moment clearly. The figure wasn't there when we took the picture, but now it was. We couldn't stop thinking about it. We compared other photos from the trip, but none showed anything unusual. Just the one. The more we discussed it, the more unsettling it became. I decided to zoom in on the figure, and when I did, my stomach dropped. I could see it now, clearer than before. The shape wasn't just standing there, it was looking right at us. Its eyes were dark, empty holes, like someone had carved them out. That's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all. The figure we saw by the fire wasn't the same as the one in the photo. The one we had seen in the photo had been standing there the entire time watching us. The one by the fire had never moved. It was never real. We hadn't been looking at a person at all. We had been looking at a reflection of ourselves, and that figure was still out there. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend getaway to disconnect, to get away from the noise and distractions of the world. Me and my 3 friends Jake, Ellie, and Tom had spent days picking the perfect spot in the woods, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd be completely cut off if anything went wrong. We arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sun dipped behind the trees as we worked, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, idyllic even. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling stories. It was the kind of atmosphere where you felt safe, surrounded by friends and the flickering warmth of the fire. But then things began to feel off. It started with Ellie. She was sitting closest to the tree line, her back to the forest, when she suddenly froze. At first, we thought she was just being dramatic, messing around like she always did. But then she looked at us, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard something," she said, her voice shaky. We all stopped talking, listening intently. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Jake stood up, shaking his head. "Ellie, there's nothing out there. It's just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak yourself out." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She insisted she heard something movement, like footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We all stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves she was just letting her imagination run wild. But, as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift more than usual, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching us. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, and the night seemed to stretch on much longer than it should have. At some point, we decided to head to our tents. We doused the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the night. We settled into our sleeping bags, but none of us could sleep. The sounds of the forest had taken on a strange quality, like they were distorted, just out of sync. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the woods themselves were breathing. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang, like something large crashing into a tree. It was so sudden, so sharp, that we all jolted up right in our tents. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tom was the first to grab a flashlight. He crawled out of his tent cautiously, shining the beam toward the woods. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, empty trees. But then the beam caught something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. A person? No, not quite. The figure was too still, too unnaturally rigid. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in our direction. We froze. None of us dared to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It just watched. Who the hell is that? Jake hissed, barely above a whisper. We had no idea. We hadn't seen anyone else on the hike-in. No campers, no sign of anyone else around. But there it was, standing like a mannequin in the trees, its head slightly tilted, its limbs unnaturally straight. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was about to call the ranger station when the figure moved. Slowly, it turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Get inside the tents now, I yelled, grabbing Ellie by the arm and pulling her toward her tent. We scrambled, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The flashlight had flickered out, casting the camp back into darkness. We could hear the figure moving closer, the rustling of branches, the slow scrape of something dragging across the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud thud like a body hitting the ground. Then silence. We waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move, our minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But after a long while, we heard footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. One by one, we mustered the courage to step outside, the fear still heavy in our chests. When we checked the area where the figure had stood, we found something strange. It wasn't human at all. It was a mannequin, but not a normal one. This one had its face carved out, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin, and on the back of its neck, there was something scrawled in faded red letters. I see you. We ran back to our cars in the morning, barely stopping to pack up. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching us. And then, as we passed the last turn before the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the mannequin. Still watching. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip with friends. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the sounds of the city. The kind of place where you can hear the rustle of leaves and feel the crunch of twigs beneath your feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the crackling of burning wood. Jenna suggested we go for a night hike to embrace the wilderness. The others were hesitant, but I felt adventurous. The mushrooms we had consumed earlier made everything feel magical, and I wanted to explore. The darkness felt like an invitation, pulling us into its depths. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams slicing through the night like knives. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around us, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. We chatted nervously, but the mood shifted when we heard a sudden rustling. It was louder than any animal we'd encountered, like something large was moving through the underbrush. We froze, exchanging anxious glances. Then we heard a low growl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf. This was something different, something wrong. Before we could react, Jenna pointed ahead, her flashlight beam flickering over something in the distance. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. Through the trees, a figure emerged. A man, or at least, he looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as if he had never seen sunlight. He wore ragged clothes that hung loosely from his body, and his hair was wild, matted with leaves and dirt. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the emptiness in his eyes, like he was staring right through us. We instinctively backed away, trying to remain silent. But in our panic, Jenna accidentally stepped on a twig, the sound snapping through the air like a gunshot. The figure jerked his head toward us, and the growl intensified. Fear took hold, and we bolted into the trees, heartbeats racing and breath coming in short gasps. We ran without direction, branches scratching at our arms and legs as we tore through the underbrush. The growl was now a roar, echoing in the night. We could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate. It felt like something was chasing us, hunting us. I glanced back and saw the man was following, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. We finally stumbled upon a clearing, and without thinking, we hid behind a thick bush, our bodies pressed together, trembling. We listened as the footsteps grew closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice away. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought we had escaped. We remained crouched, hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Just when I thought we were safe, a rustling came from the bush right next to us. I nearly screamed when I turned my flashlight towards it, only to reveal a raccoon, its eyes reflecting the light before it scurried away. But we were not alone. A whisper came from the shadows. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable. As it grew louder, my heart sank. The voice was low and raspy, calling out Jenna's name. The darkness felt alive, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. We dared to look out from behind the bush. To our horror, we saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. He was now closer, his mouth moving as he chanted Jenna's name over and over, each utterance dripping with malice. Just as I thought we were trapped forever, something incredible happened. The figure suddenly stopped, his eyes widened, and he stumbled back, looking terrified. He turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were paralyzed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. We slowly emerged from our hiding spot, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. As we made our way back to the campsite, we talked about what we had seen. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the safety of the campfire. The horror of that night haunted us, but the morning brought a sense of relief. We quickly packed our things and left. Days later, I received a text from Jenna. She had done some research and discovered that the area we camped in was notorious for strange occurrences. Multiple reports of people vanishing had been recorded over the years, always near that same clearing. But what made my blood run cold was the final line of her message. There's something more. They say if you hear your name whispered in the woods, it means they are looking for you. The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries. They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. I've always loved camping. There's something about the crisp air, the sound of rustling trees, and the crackle of a campfire that makes everything feel right. So, when my friends and I decided to spend the weekend out in the wilderness, I thought it would be just another fun, relaxing trip. We'd set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by dense trees and a clear, star-filled sky. Little did we know that this trip would be anything but relaxing. It started out like any other camping weekend. We pitched our tents, unpacked the gear, and made a fire. We joked and laughed as we roasted marshmallows, telling stories and enjoying the peace of the forest. But when night fell and the stars filled the sky, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the once comforting sounds of the forest became unnervingly silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to fade into a muffled hum. I was the first to notice the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, the rustling of branches or small animals scurrying about. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Slow, rhythmic steps circled the camp. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. The others didn't seem to hear anything, and we were all too tired to care. But the sound grew louder, more pronounced, and it wasn't just circling anymore, it was getting closer. I excused myself to the edge of the campsite, pretending to go to the bathroom, but really just needing some space to listen. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped away from the fire, leaving me in a thick silence. Then, from the trees beyond the camp, I heard a low growl. Not an animal growl, something deeper, almost human, but wrong in every sense. My heart began to race. I walked quickly back to the fire, but as soon as I crossed the threshold of the camp, the growling stopped, replaced by a soft voice calling my name. It was so quiet, I almost couldn't hear it, but there was something distinctly familiar about it. It was my voice, only it wasn't me. It sounded like a distorted, twisted version of me, echoing from the woods behind the campsite. I sat back down next to my friends, trying to act normal, though my mind was reeling. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The others continued to laugh, oblivious, as if nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night dragged on, and I kept my eyes on the trees, expecting anything to happen. Finally, when we decided to call it a night and retreat to our tents, I heard a sharp snap of a branch behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The camp was still. I crawled into my tent, unable to sleep. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the wood outside made my skin crawl. I tried to close my eyes, but that's when I heard it again, a voice, calling my name. This time, it was right outside my tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my voice this time. It was someone else's, a whisper full of malice and hunger. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I held my breath, hoping the sound would go away. It didn't. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and then I heard a low, unsettling chuckle that sent ice through my veins. I scrambled to unzip the tent, bursting out into the night air. But as I stood up, I saw something that froze me in place. My friends were standing near the fire, all of them staring into the woods with wide eyes. But they weren't looking at anything, they were staring at themselves. Their own faces, standing in the shadows, identical to the ones in front of me. There were more of them, twice as many as there should have been. I stumbled backward, horrified. The faces in the shadows moved, stepping forward, but the real versions of my friends stayed still, their eyes locked on the duplicates. I turned to them, my voice shaking as I asked, "What's going on? Who are they?" One of the figures in the shadows, the one that looked like me, smiled. It was a smile that was not mine, a twisted grin that sent a surge of terror through me. Then, the voice whispered again, only this time it wasn't calling my name. It was laughing. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. The forest wasn't just watching us, it had been waiting for us. And now it had us all. The copies of us weren't just standing there. They were waiting for us to make the first move. They wanted us to break the silence, to show fear. But we didn't. We stood our ground, our real selves frozen in place, facing our monstrous doubles, staring into the night. And then, as if on cue, the air shifted. The footsteps returned, and from the darkness, a figure stepped forward, tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes, its face hidden behind a mask of old bark. It was time. The forest had claimed us. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought those stories were just exaggerated tales meant to scare kids. But that night changed everything. It started with a simple favor. A friend had asked me to house sit for the weekend while they were out of town. The house was old, a sprawling Victorian home with creaking wood floors and a reputation for being haunted. I laughed it off at the time. It was just a house. The first night passed uneventfully. I watered the plants, fed their cat, and binge-watched a few shows. The house had an eerie charm, with its antique furniture and dim lighting, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. On the second night, things started to feel off. The cat, normally calm and aloof, began acting strangely. She refused to stay in one room for long and hissed at empty corners. I dismissed it as animal behavior, though I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. Later that evening, while I was reading in the living room, I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. It wasn't subtle or distant. It was deliberate and heavy, as if someone was pacing back and forth. My chest tightened. The house was supposed to be empty. I stood frozen for a moment, listening as the sound stopped. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the staircase. With each step up, the air grew colder. I tried to convince myself it was just an old house settling or my imagination running wild. The hallway upstairs was dim, the single light bulb flickering weakly. I walked toward the source of the sound, a guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt a cold draft coming from inside. The room was empty, no intruders, no signs of anything out of place, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I heard a third behind me, back toward the staircase. Whipping around, I shone my flashlight down the hall but saw nothing. My pulse was racing as I checked each room, finding nothing unusual. I finally decided I was overthinking it and went back downstairs, locking the bedroom doors behind me for good measure. That night, I struggled to sleep. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards made my nerves jump. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I strained to hear the words. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room near the window. I sat up, clutching the blanket, and turned on the lamp. The whispers stopped instantly. The room was still, but I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. I looked toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure standing outside. It wasn't clear, just the outline of something tall and motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe it was the wind outside. Determined not to let fear get the better of me, I decided to check the entire property in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place until I opened the basement door. I had avoided the basement all weekend. Something about it felt wrong, like a part of the house that didn't belong, but now I felt compelled to go down there. As I descended the creaky steps, the musty smell grew stronger, and the light barely illuminated the space. It was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in the far corner, something caught my eye. A tall mirror stood there, covered in a heavy sheet. I approached it cautiously, unsure why I felt so drawn to it. Pulling the sheet away, I stared at my reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, my reflection smiled at me. I didn't smile. I froze, watching as the image in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with a look of amusement. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if it were trying to come through. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, breathing in the fresh air as if I had been drowning. My friend returned the next day, and I told them I couldn't stay there again. I didn't mention the mirror. Weeks later, they called to tell me the strangest thing. The mirror in the basement had shattered on its own. But what really made my skin crawl was the discovery underneath the shards. Scratched into the wooden frame was my name, carved over and over again. I've worked as a park ranger for years, but nothing has ever prepared me for what happened during my shift that night. It started like any other evening. I was stationed at a remote outpost, miles away from the nearest town, tasked with making sure everything was secure and that no one was out trespassing after hours. The forest around me was dense, the kind of place where sunlight barely touches the ground, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating. It was nearing midnight when I got a call on the radio from a fellow ranger. He was stationed at the other side of the park and had noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints near a restricted area, footprints that didn't match any known wildlife. He asked if I could check it out, given I was the closest one to that side. At first, I thought it was just a lost hiker or someone ignoring the park's rules. I grabbed my flashlight, strapped my sidearm on, and headed out. The night air was cold and smelled of pine, but there was something off about the atmosphere. It felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. The trail I was following had been well trodden, but it wasn't long before I noticed the prints he mentioned. They weren't human, and they weren't animal either. They were too wide, too deep. Whatever had made them was large, and it was moving quickly. I radioed my colleague, but the signal cut out. Strange, considering I had a strong connection just moments ago. I continued on, hoping it was just a technical glitch. The deeper I got into the woods, the more unnerving everything felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted limbs blocking out most of the starlight. The silence was absolute now. No animals, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the frost-covered ground. As I moved further, the footprints began to get fresher, as if whatever had made them was still nearby. Then, I heard it, something moving through the brush. At first, it was subtle, just the rustle of leaves. I froze, holding my breath. Then it got louder, closer. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I raised my flashlight, scanning the area. My heart pounded in my chest. A shadow moved just out of the beam's reach, too fast to catch, and I snapped my head toward it, my hand tight on the flashlight. There was nothing. I was starting to think I was just spooked. But then the feeling hit me, the unmistakable sense that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the light. I turned quickly, half expecting to see a bear or some large animal in the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, but as I looked closer, I saw something that wasn't natural, a figure standing motionless just ahead of me. It was tall, too tall for a person, its outline blurry like it was blending into the shadows. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but as I did, the figure did the same, mirroring my movements. My heart raced. It was so quiet that even my breathing sounded too loud. I squinted into the dark, trying to make out more details. But the more I stared, the more it seemed to shift, like the shadows themselves were stretching and molding into it. That's when I realized it wasn't just standing still, it was watching me, waiting. I wasn't sure what it was, but I could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, locked on mine. A sudden crackling from my radio broke the silence, and I flinched. A voice came through, garbled and distant at first, but then clear enough to make out. "Stay where you are. Don't turn around." It was my colleague. I wanted to respond, but before I could, the figure shifted again, this time closer. I snapped the beam of my flashlight onto it, hoping to scare whatever it was away, but the light flickered and died. I tried again, but it was useless. In the panic of the moment, I did the one thing I shouldn't have. I turned around. The forest behind me was still, nothing but darkness. My flashlight flickered back to life, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement behind the trees, too quick to catch. Then, a loud crash erupted from behind me, making me jump out of my skin. I whipped around, heart pounding in my throat. There was nothing there. Not a single sign of the figure. No footprints, no trace. I ran back to my truck as fast as I could, shaking, the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground deafening in the eerie quiet. By the time I reached the outpost, I was breathing heavily, my hands trembling. I didn't stop to check the radio again or look back. I just locked the doors and stayed inside. The next morning, the park had returned to its usual quiet. The forest seemed peaceful again. But when I checked my boots, I found something in the dirt. Too large, deep footprints leading to my truck, stopping right at the driver's side door. The prints weren't mine, and they weren't human. The park had never felt the same again. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone." The air was thick with the scent of pine as we made our way to the campsite. It was one of those perfect weekends. The weather had been clear, and the night promised to be crisp. I was with my two closest friends, Jake and Sarah. We'd camped together for years, so nothing felt unusual as we hiked deep into the woods, our backpacks heavy with gear, and the sound of our footsteps crunching over the forest floor. By the time we set up the tents and got the fire going, the sun had dipped low. We settled around the flames, talking about everything and nothing. Jake was the type to tell ghost stories at every opportunity, but tonight, he seemed more subdued than usual. Sarah noticed it too, asking if he was feeling okay. He just brushed it off, but his gaze kept darting into the darkness beyond the firelight, like something was pulling at him from the shadows. We didn't think much of it. Campers get jumpy sometimes. The night dragged on, and after a while, Sarah and I grew tired. We zipped up our tents, and Jake made a final trip to the woods to take care of business. That's when it happened. I was lying in my sleeping bag, my eyes drifting shut, when I heard it. A rustling, like branches snapping underfoot. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze. My mind immediately jumped to wild ideas. Maybe an animal. Maybe Jake had left something outside and a bear or deer had wandered near. The sound came again, closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like breathing, low and slow. It wasn't Jake. No human breath ever sounded like that. It was ragged, uneven, and inhuman. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and flicked it on. I poked my head out of the tent and scanned the dark woods around our campsite. There was nothing, just the usual sway of trees in the wind. Then I heard footsteps. Barely audible, but they were there, coming from the opposite side of the camp. My blood ran cold. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I crawled out of my tent and quickly unzipped Sarah's. I shook her awake. She gradually opened her eyes, and I whispered for her to be quiet. We both listened intently, footsteps, steady, deliberate, approaching from the trees. I motioned for Sarah to stay quiet, and we crawled to the edge of the camp, hidden in the shadows. The sounds were unmistakable now. Someone, no. Something was moving through the woods toward us. It didn't feel like a person. The movements were too slow, too deliberate, and the breathing. It was louder now, unmistakable, like someone or something was trying to remain hidden, but couldn't control its ragged inhalations. Jake had to be in trouble. I stood and motioned for Sarah to follow. We hurried toward the trees where we had last seen him. But as we moved into the woods, the eerie sound of footsteps stopped, and then there was a scream. A desperate, animalistic scream that came from deeper in the forest. We froze, terrified, but our instinct kicked in. We had to find him. We had to help him. We ran toward the scream, stumbling over roots and rocks in the dark. We were nearly there when we saw something that made our blood freeze. Jake, standing perfectly still in the middle of a small clearing. He wasn't screaming anymore, but something was wrong. He was staring directly at us, his eyes wide, his mouth open as if frozen mid-shout. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his body stiff as a board. We called out to him, but he didn't respond. Then, from behind him, something stepped forward. At first, I thought it was another person until I saw its face. It was not human. The thing that stood behind Jake had hollow, black eyes and a twisted, wide grin. Its skin was ashen, stretched tight across its skull, and it didn't move like a person either. It shuffled forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though the body wasn't meant to move in that way. I reached out for Jake, desperate to pull him away, but he didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The thing behind him opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it whispered something in a voice so low, I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart. Then, it grinned again. The air around us seemed to thicken, like the very forest was holding its breath. I grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him back, pulling him as hard as I could. He stumbled, but didn't resist. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back at camp, panting and terrified. Jake was silent the whole time, his eyes still vacant and unfocused. He didn't speak a word. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left without a trace. Jake never spoke of what happened that night. But when I looked back at the woods one last time, I saw something standing among the trees. It was Jake, but not Jake. The thing in the woods was still there. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and a few friends. We set out into the woods, eager for some fresh air, hiking, and quiet nights around the fire. Nothing could go wrong. We pitched our tents by a small clearing beside a narrow stream, the trees around us thick, and the forest alive with the usual sounds of nature. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, laughing, joking, and snapping pictures. We returned to camp just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By nightfall, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. But when the fire crackled down to embers, something shifted. It was a subtle change, but it didn't go unnoticed. The air felt colder, heavier. The rustling of the trees grew louder, more frantic. I remember thinking it was odd how the usual chorus of night creatures had gone quiet. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves, just silence. It made the firelight seem far too small against the vast, looming dark. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I caught my friends glancing around, eyes darting to the edges of the trees, as though they were hearing things too. But when I asked if anyone else felt it, they shrugged it off. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to laugh it off, but there was a tension in the air that none of us could shake. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning in my tent, the sense of being watched pressing down on me. The next morning, we decided to pack up early. We'd seen all we needed to see, and the unease from the night before isn't something any of us wanted to ignore. But, as we began to gather our things, something strange happened. My friend Dave, who had been the first to wake up, looked horrified. He was staring at the ground near his tent, his face pale. Hey, guys, you might want to look at this. We followed him over, all of us a little nervous. At first, I thought it was just an animal track, perhaps a deer or a bear, but when I crouched down to inspect it, my heart skipped a beat. The print was enormous, far too large for any animal I knew to live in these woods. It was human-shaped, but twisted, the toes far too long, and the heel unnaturally deep. That's not possible, I whispered. As we all stood there, trying to make sense of it. A sudden rustling came from the tree line. It was fast to be an animal, and too deliberate to be the wind. We froze, hearts racing, but nothing emerged. Dave suggested we leave immediately, and no one argued. We packed up quickly, eyes scanning the surrounding woods as we hurried to break down the camp. The trees around us were unnervingly still, the silence now deafening. like the forest itself was holding its breath. We were halfway back to the car when it happened. A scream, sharp, ragged, and full of terror, split the air. We spun around, instinctively searching the woods. At first, we saw nothing, just the dark expanse of trees. But then, we noticed something out of place. Between the trunks, a figure was standing just out of reach of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline was too faint to make out in detail. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it moved. The figure stepped forward with a smooth, unnatural grace, its long, spindly limbs stretching far beyond what should have been possible. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but its presence was enough to paralyze us with fear. Run. Dave finally managed to rasp, and we did. We ran through the woods like we'd never run before, stumbling, tripping, barely able to keep our footing. The figure was gone, but we all felt its eyes on us, following every step. We reached the car, breathless, eyes wild. The woods behind us seemed impossibly far away as we drove, the eerie silence still clinging to the air. But it wasn't until we were miles down the road, trying to shake off the adrenaline, that we realized something strange. We'd left our phones back at camp. We stopped at a gas station to grab a charger and checked our messages. There was one, sent to all of us in the middle of the night. "I see you." It had come from Dave's phone. But when we checked it, he was sitting right next to us. His phone was in his hand, and it hadn't been touched. We all stared at it, the words hanging in the air. How had it sent that message, and, more terrifyingly, who had sent it? We had been planning this camping trip for months. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, and 3 close friends. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp, cool air that made you feel alive. We were excited, naive even, about what awaited us deep in the woods. There were no trails, no paths, just an untouched part of the forest, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside time. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening sharing stories, laughing, and watching the sky darken. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, distant owl calls, and the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of unseen creatures. At first, it was all part of the adventure, but as the night deepened, a strange unease began to settle over us. We joked about it, but something in the air felt different. There was a presence, something just beyond the firelight. Around midnight, we heard it, a soft scratching noise, just outside the perimeter of the fire. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal we knew. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. One of us joked that it was a bear or a raccoon, but even as we laughed, the scratching continued. And then, it stopped. Silence. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Our laughter died in our throats as the air grew heavier. Another sound. This time, it was a low thud, like something large had fallen nearby. It was followed by an eerie, unnatural silence. Our eyes darted toward the edge of the firelight, the trees just beyond the reach of our flame. The night felt to still. I stood up, wanting to reassure everyone. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was hammering. The others hesitated, but none of them wanted to be the ones to sit alone by the fire. They followed me as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped beyond the circle of warmth. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. "It's nothing," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else, but something gnawed at me. I scanned the area, moving the flashlight back and forth, when I noticed something strange. A few feet away, just under a tree, a pile of leaves had been disturbed. But the odd thing wasn't the pile, it was the shape beneath it. It looked wrong. The pile wasn't natural, it was too neat, too perfect, almost like a body. I froze. Then I heard it, a soft, shallow breath, too close, too real. It came from just behind me. I whipped around, my heart skipping a beat. But there was nothing but darkness. "What is it?" My brother's voice trembled behind me. The others stood just out of the flashlight's reach, their faces pale in the dark. "Stay here," I whispered, taking a step forward toward the strange pile. The flashlight's beam quivered in my hand as I moved closer, my feet crunching on the dry leaves. I reached down to move the leaves, and then I saw it. A hand, pale, twisted, and partially buried. The hand of something human. No, the fingers were too long, too thin, the nails sharp and yellow. I jerked back, but as I did, something in the trees above moved. My eyes shot upward, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, but growing clearer. A whisper, "Help? Me, please." I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. I knew something was behind me. I could feel it. I turned, and there it was, a face, not far off. It was pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too wide, too empty. The mouth stretched into a twisted grin that was more of a sneer, the skin hanging loosely, as if it had been drained of life. It didn't belong there. It didn't move like anything I had ever seen. It was too still, too unnatural. I screamed. The others bolted into motion, running, but the thing's gaze never left me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and quick. I almost tripped over my own feet as I turned and sprinted toward the fire. But the thing it followed us. We made it back to the fire pit, gasping for breath, the flames casting frantic shadows in every direction. But, as we huddled there, the scratching started again. This time, it was closer. The leaves on the ground shifted. Slowly, almost casually, the thing stepped out from the shadows, its feet barely touching the earth. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We all stared at it, waiting for the next move, but it didn't make another sound. That's when the real horror struck. We realized it wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure, crouched low to the ground, stepping into view. Then another, and another, all of them pale, gaunt, their eyes wide and empty. They didn't move, they just stood there in the darkness, staring at us. It wasn't just one thing, there were dozens of them. And then, just as quickly, they were gone. No movement, no sound. Only the rustling of leaves in the distance. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. what I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes.